It was 50 years ago that the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, took a trip to Dallas, Texas, and was gunned down in front of the public while his limousine was driving a motorcade route. Just a very brief time afterwards, a suspect was apprehended named Lee Harvey Oswald. This slight and soft-spoken man was viewed as a vile, murderous monster right from the start because those involved in the investigation pinned it on him right away. The assassination has turned into a curiosity and footnote in American history, but I think knowing the truth about what happened that day and why may be more important than any other event in our lifetimes. Many of us feel perturbed about the whole event and a bit of agitation creeps into our stomach. I'm included in this group, so I decided to take a fresh look from an independent standpoint and find out if he did it or he was innocent. In the end, I figured out it wasn't just about who the trigger men were, but who contracted them, and that this single event has caused a skew in the timeline of America and the world and set into motion a series of dominoes that have begun falling and continue to affect us in a major way, even 50 years later. I uncovered some incredible information that sheds light on those events through the morass of lies, hype, wild theories, and misinformation. I felt it necessary to teach others about it so we can try to fix these things today and never let this happen again tomorrow. Before we dive into the JFK assassination, I want you to bear with me for a moment. Let's talk about human nature, specifically the nature of men. Men do many different things in life for many different reasons, but most men go through life trying to achieve as much as they can so that they can get the woman they want and make enough money that they can do whatever they want, as well as leave a legacy. Most want to leave their families cared for after they are gone and continue their genetic line. This is basically how men are wired biologically. Most want to live happily, enjoy life, as well as assure our legacy by the survival and thriving of our children. So what happens when a man achieves these things? What happens when a man has so much money that he can never spend it all in a lifetime? What happens when a man has been satisfied by the woman or women in his life, already had children, and knows that many generations to come will be assured financial stability? A man who has had all the experiences that he could think of in all the cars, boats, jet planes, and everything else he could ever have? Men who achieve all these things in life are usually the types that are very hard workers, obsessive, intelligent, and driven. They have gotten so much through birth or very hard work, but they still want more. They still want to accomplish more and strive for that next level. When a man has all he could ever desire, and even men who aspire to this, will strive for the next level, and that is when he wants power. Power means control, measuring up to your peers, leaving a legacy, and the ability to push your ideas forward and defeat the ideas of others. Power cannot be measured, so there is no end to it, and some people who are set on getting as much as they can are almost like drug addicts looking for a fix. Power can be just as addicting as anything else, and over history, this has led to grim consequences. The men who built the system of government in the United States were aware of the shortcomings of men and men in power because they saw it happen all over the world. They had seen how things begin to fall apart and society suffer when the desires of a few win out over the desires of a whole people. They thought by creating this democracy, it may help to curb the problem of men in power taking advantage of that power by using a system of checks and balances, meaning there really was no one man or group in charge at any time, and the leaders would be chosen by the people. This was a great idea at its base, but there were many loopholes in this that they never suspected, and they have all been found and taken advantage of by those who came after them. In our current time, there has been the development of certain intelligence organizations, as well as powerful corporate interests influencing politics. This created a chance for power, secrecy, and warfare, both standard and psychological, to thrive. At the same time, they kept the image up to the people through mass media that is always a fair and honest government, with leaders who can always be blindly trusted. This is a fatal error of the people because history has shown the opposite. This may seem shocking to some people, but part of the way the American system works is so that the average citizen never really thinks about the big picture with all that's going on in their individual lives, and reject the idea of our government ever doing anything monumentally evil or malicious, even at a subconscious level. Conspiracy is a word that I have grown to dislike. Conspiracy theory is even worse. The second people even hear this word, they immediately jump to a conclusion before even hearing what it may be about. Some just love conspiracy theories and will believe every one they hear, and only research along the line of the theory they believe, picking apart minute details, never acknowledging that it may only be partially true, not true at all or otherwise. On the other hand, there are people who have grown tired of hearing them, or just dismiss them based on the fact that it's called a conspiracy theory in the first place. They tune out as soon as they get an inkling that it may be called a conspiracy theory. This is why I don't like the terms at all, because they create such a divide before the point is ever made. The problem is that there are theories that make sense, and there are ones that are just ludicrous. As far as the JFK assassination, there are so many it would blow your mind, and you could never hear them all. Everything from the driver to Jackie Kennedy herself pulling the trigger. The problem is, with such a large amount of theories and information, the truth is easily lost in the shuffle. This happens with most conspiracy theories, blurring the line of real and fake, causing most of them to be ignored, false, or rendered moot. This is an effect that actually helps the true perpetrators of the crime, because the more theories that are out there, the more ridiculous they are, the more the truth has been blurred. Another branch of conspiracy, especially on the internet, is what I call spooky theories. They are videos and articles that usually have doom and gloom music or just text scrolling around the screen and the flashing of a few pictures. Some would argue that it matches up with the subject matter, but in my opinion it turns most people off and lends less credibility to the message. They leave you scared of this or that, with a feeling of hopelessness and helplessness that is not constructive. Many conspiracy theorists blame secret societies, rogue elements in the government, other nations, all the way to aliens and a reptilian race that secretly control the world, as well as hundreds more examples. Does spreading all these ideas out on the table really help accomplish anything? Let's look at history in an interesting and engaging way, so that it can be digested by everyone, not just certain sections of our culture. Conspiracy has become big business in itself, especially with the current state of our society. As a result, it becomes profitable to create these ideas, and many of them don't rely on very much or any hard evidence. Secrets, lies, and covert operations have been a part of every society since the beginning of civilization. Methods of secrecy and undercover operations have also been evolving with technology, industry, and social progression, just as everything else in civilization has. All organizations have an element of secrecy and don't ask, don't tell built into them as a general rule. For example, most people who work together may not divulge their hourly wage to their fellow employees. Most of the time they are not asked or lie about it. This doesn't mean that they are doing something evil or wrong, they just don't want to reveal certain things to others. This is one example of how secrecy is acceptable in our world. Secrets between a group of people can be difficult, but men realized that they could conduct operations involving multiple people without any one of those single individuals knowing they were participating in something bigger. This has been tested and achieved many times in different organizations. One of the best ways to distribute information as well as engage people in an operation that you don't want the full scope of to be revealed is to use a system called compartmentalization. Compartmentalization utilizes a need-to-know idea, meaning that everyone involved in the operation only gets the information they need to accomplish the task that they are asked. They are not informed of the full scope or directive of what they are involved in, but just enough to do their part. Using this system, you can get many people to be part of something either good, evil, or indifferent, with or without their knowledge. For example, the person who puts the dashboard together in a car is not fully responsible for the car, but plays his part and only needs to play his part for the final product or result to be achieved. He does not need to know how to put the locks on the car, and in fact doesn't need to know anything but the dashboard and its specifications to get his part finished. You could even keep the rest of the car a secret from him, but in the end, you would have the same result. If we take this approach with military or business operations, the same can be achieved, with only a few people or even just one person needing to be at the top putting it all together, and they are the only ones who know the end game objective. There is one way that you can justify or cover up, lie, or deny anything that you need to, especially as a person in power or in government. It just needs to be a, quote, matter of national security. People in all positions will do almost anything if told that their participation is to do with national security. Scientific experiments have shown that people are willing and able to do just about anything, including unspeakable acts to each other, when a person in authority tells them or orders them to do it. Most people have been brought up to follow authority and do what they have been told. When you put these things together, it becomes almost a double whammy, meaning that if someone who has authority over you tells you to do something, and that it is a matter of national security, you're twice as likely to do it. Many things can be justified using the reason of national security, and also because of the nature of it needing to be kept secret, it is usually never spoken of by the participators. Most people are not aware of one of the most powerful emotions there is in human beings, fear. Fear can be the ultimate motivator. Fear is a powerful force and is used all the time as a reason to do something or not to. Fear has been built into us biologically as a survival mechanism. Way back in our family tree, This emotion was essential to prevent death or harm, such as being afraid of starving to death or being afraid of a pack of wolves. Fear can be used to make people do things they normally wouldn't do. It can be used as a tool to trick, deceive, and manipulate one person or many. It can cause good people not to act against evil, and it can cause bad people to act even worse. Sometimes we even are influenced by fears that don't seem rational. When threatened, a person is capable of things they would never be normally. Those who have authority over others regularly use fear as a motivator to get what they need done. A person who is in fear of losing their job, or in worse cases, losing their family, is much more apt to do something they normally wouldn't to protect them. This all goes back to our basic wiring. We want to live happily, make enough money, and continue our genetic line. If someone is able to threaten that, then you will do anything you can to keep it. This includes doing things that may hurt others. Let's start putting it together. We are wired to desire wealth and power, and those who achieve the most of this are usually very smart and driven individuals, or at least have come from a family that is. These people can use their power to further their ideas and interests, using authority and control over the people underneath them. Using compartmentalization and other forms of programming and control, they increase their stand without revealing their motives to others. These men feel a need to keep this authority and increase it more and more. They use the power to further their ideas and exterminate the ideas or belief of others. You can't necessarily get mad at those who desire these things because for the most part, in some way, everybody does. But using power for your own self-interest at the detriment of the masses of other people causes a major conflict. You end up with extremely powerful folks doing whatever they see fit, manipulating people without them even knowing it, causing massive harm as well as death to others and getting away with it scot-free. This can be a double-edged sword, because if men had no reason to strive to reach lofty goals, to get in power, many things that we take for granted may never have been. To understand why men kill, we have to look at the reasons that these things happen. Men kill for money, power, women, revenge, or God. Almost every murder ever committed can be traced to these factors. One of the main things that homicide investigators look for is who benefits from the killing to begin building their list of suspects. They look at family and friends first, then begin looking at other associates of the victim. Most of the time, the perpetrator of the crime is one of these people. Since the Kennedy killing was at its root a homicide, I decided to take the same outlook on building my list of suspects. These are not conspiracy theories, even though they may be called that. Instead, they are just ideas based on facts or accounts of witnesses. It has been 50 years since this happened, and even though it's considered a closed case, it really needs to be reopened and re-examined because 75% or more of Americans don't think we got the right result. This is important because it was the highest profile homicide of the 20th century, and in the mind of the masses, someone got away with it. Kennedy will have a large list of people to look at based on his job and his life, and I was determined to look at as many possibilities as there were. People who were to commit this murder had a great advantage. They knew there would be a ton of suspects. They also knew that critical thinking people would start pointing fingers all over the place at all sorts of different people and groups. The ones who were the type to go along to get along would accept the results in the short and fast investigation that resulted in the story of a lone, crazed gunman. They also knew that the people who questioned that result would have so many ideas of who could have done it that they would be confused with all the different possibilities. The confusion from this would actually benefit the killers because nobody would ever know who actually did it, instead of obsessing over this detail or that. They would get so involved and married to their own theory that they would reject others. In the end, the truth would be so obscured nobody would ever know what really happened, except for the men who actually aimed down that sight and pulled the trigger. And even if and when these men admit to doing this, they most likely will not be believed or discredited. Then again, evidence may show Oswald did do this, and he was killed before his confession, even though he enthusiastically denied the charges. It is easy to just accept it as what happened, because at the end of the day, it is the least frightening scenario or reason for his assassination. And at the same time, you can seem smart to go with the story and call anyone who disagrees paranoid. It keeps you feeling warm and cozy when your head hits the pillow. Let's get a better idea of what happened. Let's dive into the investigation by listing our main suspects. Because if Oswald didn't do it, the evil people who did must have had a reason for it, and most likely are still in positions of power today. Before I get into the meat of this, there are a few more things that need to be said. The people who I'm listing as suspects are not necessarily just one person, but rather a group of individuals in some cases. I believe that most of the people that are involved in these groups are not bad people. Because of compartmentalization, power, authority, money, national security, and other factors, there are certain people who belong to these groups that had a lot to do with or may be responsible for what happened. But that is not to say that everyone in these groups are evil, corrupt murderers. I will name names later, and these are in no particular order. So these are our suspects for the murder of JFK and what they would gain from it. The first suspect to approach is the Mafia, also known as the mob. These guys sure had a problem with JFK, but to get a good understanding of why, you need to know how JFK was elected, as well as a country called Cuba that the mob has had their hands in. So back when Kennedy was running for president, he needed a few key states to secure his place as the winner. His dad was good friends with the unions, which the mob has always had a hold on, and he had himself a sit down with some of these characters in the unions and the mob. He told these guys that it would be in their best interest to get his son JFK elected and convince them to get their people to vote for him. The mob was happy to have a chance for getting their man in office. JFK got the support from the unions in these key states and won the election by a hair. In a crazy twist of fate, just after his son was elected, Joe Kennedy, JFK's dad, had a stroke that caused him to be unable to speak as well as partially paralyzing him. Due to this, JFK had no reason to think that he owed the Mafia anything and viewed them, as most of us would have back then, as a major problem in the USA. He appointed his brother Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, and Robert went after the mob with a vengeance. He indicted and jailed more mobsters and organized crime figures than ever before and began to pick apart the mob piece by piece. This would be infuriating enough for the mob on its own. But wait, there's more. Cuba is thought of as some strange island we get cigars from illegally and was run by some crazy communist guy named Castro. Things weren't always like this. Before Castro, Cuba was one of America's favorite playgrounds, as well as a source of great raw materials for our corporations. Between 1940 and 1959, America basically had their buddy as a president of Cuba, and we took full advantage. In a nutshell, you could say we owned Cuba. Our corporations got tons of raw materials from there at rock bottom prices. One of the biggest and most well known of these was sugar. But the mob also loved the place because it was outside of US law, was close to the US, and became a great vacation spot and little island paradise for vacationing Americans. Havana was basically like a little Las Vegas in its day. Gambling, prostitution, drugs, many other vices were there for the enjoyment of Americans and the profit of the Mafia. All just a ferry ride away from the States. This was big business for everyone involved, especially the mob. Then this inconsiderate douche named Castro decided that he didn't want his country to be our little and party place. The nerve of this guy to want the people of Cuba to be in charge of their country and reap the benefits of their own land. Anyways, Mr. Selfish here led a revolution and threw out our boys in power and took over. He also made friends with the Soviets, another one of our enemies. The mob was now royally pissed off. But why blame Kennedy for the whole Castro and losing Cuba fiasco? How could the mob fix at least the Cuba problem and get their hotels and casinos back? Well, they needed to figure out how to overthrow the government and Castro in a coup d'etat, which in English means a sudden dispatch of a government by a small group. They needed to find someone who was good at this kind of thing, but it wasn't exactly their specialty. Sure, they know how to whack someone and set up gambling and prostitution operations, but they needed to find someone or some group with a common interest in Cuba, getting rid of Castro, and knows how to overthrow a government and has done it before. This would seem a great time to introduce our next suspect, the CIA. I know, the CIA are good guys, right? Yeah, in some cases, and I believe that this community has many good people with good values, but the nature of what they do can lead to some pretty negative consequences. Let's take a look at their own mission statement, which is taken directly from their website. Number 1, collecting information that reveals the plans, intentions, and capabilities of our adversaries and provides the basis for decision and action. Number 2, producing timely analysis that provides insight, warning, and opportunity to the president and decision makers charged with protecting and advancing America's interests. And 3, conducting a covert action at the direction of the president to preempt threats or achieve U.S. policy objectives. Okay. So this seems pretty cut and dry. These guys are our spies and conduct secret actions to further our interests. Quote, preempt threats and advance our policies internationally. But their actions in Cuba situation caused major friction with Kennedy. The CIA viewed Cuba as an asset that they did not want to lose for multiple reasons. They knew back then that controlling Cuba would continue to produce raw materials for the USA, as well as the possibility for drilling for oil in the Gulf, and we definitely did not want it to become a Soviet-friendly communist country. The country had been taken over by someone completely out of control of the US government, and to add to that, he was friendly with our biggest nuclear Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union. Without Kennedy's knowledge, the CIA and the mob basically became pals. They shared a common interest. They began to train anti-Castro Cubans under the direction and including the support of the CIA and the Mafia here in the United States. They invaded Cuba with the intention of getting the government back. This failed horribly because Kennedy never sent any US military air support or any support to these rebels, leaving their balls in the wind to get trounced embarrassingly in what is known as the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Many people, especially on the extreme right, saw Kennedy as treasonous and horrible because of this. The overthrow of Castro never worked, even though the CIA had other plans using their own as well as mob hitmen to assassinate Castro. These plans never came to fruition either. So now the CIA was like, what the f***? Our job is to conduct covert actions and to advance US interests and preempt threats to the US, and Kennedy is pissed off at us for trying to do our job? It's not like the CIA didn't know how to overthrow governments. We did it in Iran, we did it in Guatemala. Cuba would be cake. Kennedy promised that after all this went down, he would, quote, shatter the CIA into a million pieces and scatter it to the wind. He was thinking, how dare they just go in and do something like this without my permission? I'm the f***ing president. They're supposed to report to me and follow my directions. I can't believe they would do all the secret black ops bullshit without telling me. He even fired the head of the CIA. So now the CIA may be thinking, hey, it's our job to protect this country, and this guy Kennedy wants to destroy us? You know, that may be considered a threat to our national security, wouldn't it? Oh my fucking God, Castro and Cuba took out our people, as well as allies with the communists that we hate and fear because they have nukes and they are probably trying to kill us all and take over the world with communism. How can the CIA fix this? How can we keep our jobs and power in the American intelligence landscape with this piece of shit, peace-loving Kennedy trying to destroy us? Holy shit, what are we gonna do? I'm glossing over these suspects a bit, but I don't want to get bogged down in too much detail yet. It's getting kind of intense here. Let's talk about the guy we all know really did it, right? Lee Harvey Oswald. He worked in the building that Kennedy was shot next to. Some witnesses at the scene of the shooting reported seeing a rifle sticking out the window there, and a man holding it matching Oswald's description. About 10 minutes after the shooting, acting upon eyewitness information, they sealed off the book depository, and Oswald was reported as missing from the building at that point. His description went out over the police radios. He was in the building during the shooting, but left shortly after. He left the rifle he ordered through the mail at the spot he shot the president from, along with some empty shell casings. He took a bus and a cab home, changed hurriedly, and grabbed a revolver. Then somehow got to a different location, probably from a ride or something, and was walking down the street when a cop pulled over to talk to him. Then Oswald blew the cop's head off and began to run away. He ran into a movie theater, and that's where the cops got their hands on him, and he was arrested. He was pro-communist because he was seen handing out propaganda in New Orleans and even appeared on local TV there claiming he was a Marxist. Not to mention, after he left the US Marines, he defected to Russia and denounced his US citizenship. Did I mention how scary communism in Russia was? The main reason he was made as a killer was because he was at the scene of the crime, considered a commie jerk who just wanted notoriety because he never had a daddy and was an introvert. And we all know introverts are weirdos. Some guy, Ruby, shot him a few days later when he was being transported from police headquarters to county jail. Oswald died at the same hospital JFK did, never confessing to the assassination. I may go into further detail later, but that's what you need to know for now, if you didn't know that already. The next group I'd like to talk about is the US military, sometimes referred to as the military-industrial complex. This group consists of not just admirals, generals, soldiers, but also the companies in the United States that make weapon and other contraband used in warfare. One thing that nobody would ever disagree on is that war is big business. Billions and billions of dollars are spent on wars, and if there was no war to fight, then there's a problem for these companies. When Kennedy was president, the conflict in Vietnam was escalating. The military needed an enemy after World War II and focused on communism. We weren't about to start a nuclear war just like that with the Soviets, but we could try to stop the spread of communism in other parts of the world. The one sticking out at the time was Vietnam, where there was a small number of troops and advisors of the US already. Kennedy said, well, I think we should just remove the small amount we have there and just leave it alone. It's not our country, not our war. He even signed an executive order to remove the troops from Vietnam completely by 1965. Would you believe he actually challenged the Soviets and other countries to a peace race? The military was obviously thinking, what the hell? This guy wants peace? Oh God, this is bad. This is bad. We need to go to war against communism. It'll be a domino effect. One country goes commie, then the next, and the next. And that would be horrible. What the hell is with this whole Kennedy? Are we supposed to sit around here and twiddle our dicks until 1968? Doesn't he know that America's biggest business is war? We need to protect and advance America's interests. This guy Kennedy is mucking up the works. The president himself is a threat to national security. So far we have quite a few people pissed at Kennedy. But guess what? I'm not finished. The big banks that have a large stake in the financial institutions, currency, and of course banking for the whole world had beef with JFK too. These are very powerful men. They've been kicking some serious ass since the beginning of the 20th century. It took some ingenious trickery and smart moves to get into the positions that they're in today. Long ago, people began to acquire wealth, and instead of just keeping all the money in a shoe or somewhere else where it may be stolen, they decided that it may be smart to put it somewhere, quote unquote, safe. That is where banking began. Banking has evolved a lot since its simple beginnings. People would bring their gold, silver, and other currencies to a banker, and the banker would give them what's called a banknote in return so that they could retrieve their money whenever they would need it, kind of like an IOU. The bank would then have enough gold stocked up in their vaults to begin loaning money to other people who need it, and their incentive for loaning money would be to acquire even more money by charging interest on that loan. The borrower would have to pay back what he borrowed as well as an extra amount that goes directly to the bank known as interest. And I know this sounds very simple and you already know this, but the powerful banking families had a hell of an idea. They decided that instead of holding actual gold, silver, or other wealth, they would just say F it and start making banknotes even if there's nothing to back it up. In the early 20th century, 1910 to be exact, a group of bankers got together and decided to create an entity to merge their interests together and form a privately owned, centralized bank that would basically control the finances of the USA and in turn, the rest of the world. Some of the richest people in the world at the time were against this idea. The way they saw it, they were already super rich and merging would only mean that they lose some of their wealth. So it was just kind of put on the back burner. In an almost predictable twist, some of the men who were against this new bank idea jumped on a boat to America that was unsinkable in 1912. Well, it sank. Big banks made this dream a reality in 1913 by getting President Woodrow Wilson to sign it into law and called it the Federal Reserve Bank. Even though federal is in its name, it's a private bank owned by private interests and it's not accountable to anyone, including the government, its people, or anybody else. Pretty clever calling it federal. Anytime the government or a bank would need any more money, the directors of the Federal Reserve can call up their buddies at the US Mint to print up some fresh bills. Then the genius part comes in. They give that money to the government or the bank as a loan. That's where USA's trillions in debt comes from. Every dollar in your pocket represents a loan, not wealth. The genius part is that they don't even have to back up the banknotes they now print with any kind of actual material wealth. Yes, they figured out how to literally print as much money as they wanted out of thin air and make it real. Now you know why the price of things always seems to go up and never down. This is because the more dollars are printed, the more worthless they become. So why did these guys have a beef with JFK? Because JFK saw that the Federal Reserve was no good for the American people, that it basically put everyone in unavoidable debt, and signed an order for the US Treasury to begin printing silver certificates, which are dollars backed up by silver bullion, to rein in the power that the big bankers and their private interests have over the American people. He knew that they had robbed America of all their wealth. Do you think that these men didn't notice that JFK was curbing their grand scheme? Kennedy was the last guy to ever go up against these heavy hitters, and after his death, these bills printed by the Treasury stopped being printed. Now, since we're keeping an open mind, and anyone can be a suspect, I don't have much shame in throwing the Dallas police into the fray of suspects. When I began going over the complete screw-up of an investigation, total failure in collecting and maintaining a chain of evidence, as well as other factors that they must take a lot of the blame. Another incriminating bit of information is that many of the Dallas PD frequented the Carousel Club, owned by Jack Ruby, the man who has mafia ties and shot Oswald. Since the mafia was involved in the Carousel Club and hundreds of Dallas PD employees frequented that club, then you must connect the Dallas PD to organized crime. When I discuss the crime scene and what happened directly after the shooting in the next few days in Dallas, you'll see why I think the Dallas PD screwed up royally. Speaking of screwing up royally, how about the Secret Service? This organization had only one main job that day: keep Kennedy alive and well. They failed horribly. They are guilty of not doing their normal job, following normal protocol, and not protecting the most important man in the US government. The actions of some of them that day are very questionable, even suspicious, especially the man driving the car Kennedy was in, as well as the man sitting next to him. Hope you boys had fun partying in Fort Worth the night before the assassination. Hope it was worth it. I'm putting you boys aside for now, but I'm not finished with you yet. And speaking along these lines, even though I'm not naming them as a suspect, the US journalists and media should forever be ashamed for their complicity in the cover-up. They are supposed to be the people getting the truth for the citizens of this country. I don't care if you think you're being patriotic or not. Next up, I'm gonna throw a few in together because they had similar connections. The FBI and the ONI, which is the Office of Naval Intelligence. Members of the FBI admitted under oath to destroying files on Lee Harvey Oswald, as well as the destruction of a lot of important evidence that was collected from witnesses that day. If they weren't directly responsible for the shooting, then they must be looked at strongly in regards to a cover-up, especially because the man in charge of the FBI was a fairly corrupt figure who was tied in with both the mob, the CIA, and used blackmail against men in powerful positions. Someone who has the tendency to commit blackmail would definitely use the assassination for same reasons. That is a speculative reach, I know, but what excuse is there for any credible law enforcement to destroy or hide evidence, or to redact pages and pages of documents 50 years later? The Office of Naval Intelligence needs to be mentioned because they also had a lot of information on Oswald that never came to light, and evidence suggests, and I will show, that Oswald may have been an agent of the ONI. I've been trying to avoid names as much as possible so far, only naming Jack Ruby and Lee Oswald. The reason for this is it can become overwhelming when you start naming all the names involved, but I have to part with that for this last suspect, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ as I will refer to him from now on, was the vice president in 1963, and a few hours after JFK was shot, he became the 36th president of the United States. But he must have been close with JFK, right? I mean, why would Kennedy choose him as VP if he didn't like him? Well, the reason for that is because when you beat someone's ass in the primaries and become your party's nominee, it's just in good taste to offer the VP spot to the guy who came in second place. Now, normally the person who lost would deny with the tip of the hat to the winner, and this is what Kennedy's camp expected, but they were shocked when LBJ jumped at the chance. I'm sure Kennedy was like, what the f***, I didn't think he would take it. I don't want to deal with this guy for 4 years. Oh well. LBJ was the butt of the joke to Kennedy, who regularly made jokes about him and his wife. LBJ also had an axe to grind, because he had played a part in Texas, much like Joe Kennedy did in Chicago and other states, to sway, or in less PC terms, steal the election in Texas. LBJ was thinking that in 64, maybe 68, that he would be the next president and succeed Kennedy. Then rumors abound that the only one that JFK wanted to succeed him was his little bro, Robert. Oh, LBJ hated Kennedy now and felt insulted by him. He knew Kennedy was doing drugs and banging broads like no other, at the same time running the country and sending it into a peaceful direction. He probably thought of Kennedy as a rich northern dickhead blue blood who didn't deserve his seat as president. LBJ didn't like that Kennedy possibly made a secret deal with the Soviet leader not to invade Cuba. Many right-wingers and extreme anti-communists thought that a communist presence in our hemisphere was outrageous and very dangerous. LBJ was a power-hungry, fierce politician. It is easy to see when you study his career. He was arguably one of the most powerful leaders during the Eisenhower administration as a majority leader in the Senate. He had powerful connections in Texas, where he was from, and he was good buddies with John Connally, who was in the car with Kennedy during the shooting. He really stood no chance against the good-looking, young, fresh-faced, and well-spoken Kennedy in the election of '60, being an old curmudgeon with an ugly scowl that you almost don't trust just looking at him. Personal friends and associates said that he was more anxious to become president than you could believe, and would do anything to get that spot. He was also getting into some legal trouble just before the assassination, and was having charges brought up on him the day the assassination happened. So I think that qualifies him as a suspect pretty well. He had a lot to gain by Kennedy literally losing his head. The day he died, JFK started the morning in Fort Worth, Texas. He gave a speech at a breakfast, and afterwards, the presidential party boarded Air Force One to Dallas, Texas. He was to take a motorcade parade route ending at the Dallas Trade Mart, where he was to speak again. He was not in Dallas all that long before he was killed. After a warm welcome on Main Street, the motorcade came to Houston Street, then slowly turned onto Elm Street, where it would meet up with the freeway to the Trade Mart. This is a place called Dealey Plaza, which is where he was gunned down in his car and fell into the arms of his wife. He was then rushed to the local hospital called Parkland Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. There are a few pieces of evidence to focus on capturing the shooting itself. The first to speak of is the Zapruder film. Zapruder was in Dealey Plaza and had a great view, and shot a great video of the assassination itself. Many accept this video as ironclad evidence documenting the assassination, and I would normally agree, but unfortunately, we do not have a proper chain of custody of this evidence, and it could have been altered. The film wasn't shown to the American public for 12 years. Some photographic intellectuals have found many problems that can't be explained with the videos. You could call these optical impossibilities. When I worked on the video I'm to show you, I personally worked for hours on the original tape to try to get it to look as normal as possible. The regular film seems to speed up and slow down in places and is definitely missing frames or small parts of the tape. So I feel it's an altered and/or incomplete document. Nevertheless, I'm thankful for it because it gives us some sort of idea of what it looked like. Incredibly, one of the officers on a motorbike that day had his button stuck down on transmit, and you hear the hum of his engine even though he's not talking. They found this piece of tape in the 1970s investigation and realized that it caught the audio of the assassination itself. So I sat down with the best copy of this Zapruder film I could find, along with the audio from the Dallas Police radio. After altering the speed of the film in multiple locations to make it seem to me that the movements were more realistic, the audio fit very well into the sound of the shots, especially the last two. I also used a program to take the shaking of the camera away. Here is my version of the Zapruder film along with audio. This is very violent and disturbing, especially with the audio, along with my fixes to make the film run smoothly. I have admittedly altered the original, my attempt to fix the speed problems. This was not difficult to do, and could easily have been done back in the 60s with the proper equipment and budget. Here it is. Next, I want to show a computer simulation of what a shooter would see from the window Oswald was allegedly in when he shot and killed JFK, as well as hitting Governor Connally. What you just saw in film moments ago has changed not just American history forever, but the United States and the world forever. There is one thing about the official story of the assassination that really hits well with me. Most of the time, with most things that happen, the simplest answer is the right one. The more complex and the more people you get involved in anything, the less likely it is to be true, as human nature is to blab about it. This is the major problem with most of what are called conspiracy theories. Looked at in this light, the official story seems to hold up. It's simple, doesn't involve more than one crazy person, and is believable at its face. The official story put forth by the Warren Commission is as follows. Lee Harvey Oswald was working at the Texas School Book Depository where they stored and shipped books. He had a shady past, shrouded in mystery, but he had definitely spent time in Russia and was a former Marine. He was well known to be pro-communist. On the day of the assassination, he was seen walking into the building with a long package. He claimed they were curtain rods. After the motorcade passed the building, Oswald was in the 6th floor window of the depository with the scoped Mannlicher Carcano rifle. He fired the first shot, which missed, and a fragment of the bullet, or piece of pavement, hit a bystander. The second shot caused a wound to Kennedy and all of Connolly's wounds. This bullet entered Kennedy's back, came out his throat, went into Connolly's back, broke a rib, came out his chest, broke his wrist, then went into his left thigh. This bullet later fell out of his leg onto his stretcher at the hospital. The third shot Oswald fired hit Kennedy in the back of the head, causing it to basically explode, and was the kill shot. 90 seconds later, after running downstairs, a Dallas officer saw him in the break room, and he was vouched for as an employee to the officer by his boss. Oswald left a few minutes later and made his way home by bus and taxi. About a mile from his home, where Oswald left on foot, a police officer who apparently tried questioning Oswald was shot 3 times in the chest and once in the head. Oswald then ran off in the direction of the Texas Theater. A man who owned a shoe store saw Oswald at the entrance to the store, ducking away from sirens and cop cars as they flew by. After he left the shoe store and entered the theater without paying for his ticket, the man from the shoe store and the woman at the theater reported this suspicious activity to the police. The police showed up at the theater and arrested Oswald after a struggle. He was questioned for 48 hours, as well as being brought out for the press, and Oswald always denied shooting anyone. He was being charged with the shooting of the president and of the officer. When he was being transferred to county jail on Sunday, he was shot dead on live TV by a man named Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby was a local nightclub owner in Hood who claimed at the time he did it so Jackie Kennedy would be spared the trauma of a trial. There you have it. Kennedy and a policeman are dead, Oswald is dead, case closed, no trial necessary. A true tragedy, but no conspiracy. Okay, now let's go back in time, all the way to 50 years ago. This is Detective Philip Marlowe on the scene, ready to travel through time and get the truth on what happened in Dallas. Let's get this old time-traveling phone going so we can see what it would have been like to investigate right after the shooting. Alright, so we know JFK was shot and taken to Parkland Hospital. Let's give them a call first, maybe talk to some people there.
Parkland Hospital, can I help you?
Yes, this is Detective Philip Marlowe. I'm an investigator on the Kennedy case.
Hello, sir.
Yes, I'm so sorry. Such a tragedy. Listen, I need to talk to one of the doctors that were working on the president today.
Yes, it was just awful. Let me get a doctor for you to speak with.
Thank you.
Just one moment.
Yes, this is the doctor. How can I help you?
Hi, this is Philip Marlowe. I'm investigating what happened today to John F. Kennedy. I really have just a few questions. I was hoping you could help me out so I could just get a better understanding of what happened today. So, if you could you just run me through basically how it went?
I would be happy to. Well, the president came in and he was obviously suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. By the time we got him into the operating room, he barely had a pulse. We tried to resuscitate him, but he died shortly after he arrived.
Wow, that's crazy. Multiple wounds, huh? Did you get a chance to see, possibly... Could you just describe to me where the wounds were?
Well, when the president came in, he had a major wound to the head. He also had a hole in his throat that looked like an entrance wound that we actually used for the tracheostomy, which is where we put the tube into the patient for breathing and such. We also noticed that on his back there was a small bullet wound, but probably what killed him would be the wound to the head, yes.
Wow. It sounds like he was hit more than I thought he was even hit. Oh, God, that's awful. So, when do you think the autopsy is going to be finished down there in Dallas?
Well, slight problem there. The president was actually taken from the building by the Secret Service and put on Air Force One. He was, I believe, flown back to Washington.
They took the body?
Yes, sir. They took him right out of here. Our coroner tried to put up quite a fight, but they just basically threw him on the ground and took the casket right back to Love Field and took right off.
So, you had a man die in your hospital and you let them take the body to a different state? I mean, this doesn't seem legal. I mean, shouldn't the autopsy be performed where the homicide happens, by the same city that the homicide occurred in? It just doesn't make sense. I mean, now I have to call a whole nother place just to find out the autopsy results.
Yes, well, yes, you do. But they left a forwarding number for us to call later at Bethesda Hospital. I believe it's in Maryland, near Washington, D.C. I mean, we would have tried harder to keep him here, but...
Yeah, you should have.
As you know, it's the president. It's not your everyday, killings. To be honest, it was a matter of national security.
Oh, God, okay. I guess I gotta just try to get as much as I can out of you for now, then. Could you describe the wound, especially, just go into the head wound, as much detail as possible, please?
Well, things are quite busy here. Quickly, I could let you know that the back right area of his head was completely blown out, a good size, about the size of your fist, and there was a hole in his right temple area. That's about all I can let you know for now. I really must be going. There's a whole lot, as you can understand, going on here today.
Yeah, you guys must be super busy. I mean, probably be busier if you didn't let them just take his body, but whatever. You've been a great help. I've got another call to make.
Well, okay then, and you have yourself a great day.
Bethesda Hospital, how can I help you?
Yeah, I'm looking for Commander James J. Humes. He's the pathologist that's worked on the Kennedy assassination. If I could have just a few words with him, that would really be great.
That's not possible.
Not possible? Why not? I'm an investigator here. I'm trying to figure out what happened.
Well, you're gonna have to wait for the report like everybody else.
Come on, man. I'm trying to do my job here. Could you just do me a solid? Just put anybody that was in the room on the phone. I'll talk to anyone.
All right. Okay, hold on.
Oh, God. Can't believe they didn't just keeping him in Dallas and taking him... I didn't even know you could put a frickin' coffin in Air Force One.
Hello? Yeah, can I help you?
Yeah, were you in the room during the autopsy?
Yes, sir, I most certainly was.
Okay, great. Can you describe the wounds to the brain for me, please? I'm trying to figure out where the headshot might have came from.
Yeah, there was no brain.
There was no brain?
No, sirree. There was no brain. I unzipped him myself from the body bag, and there was a gigantic hole in his head, but there was no brain. There was no brain to be spoken of.
That's impossible. And a body bag? He was wrapped in sheets at Parkland Hospital, that's well known, and put into like a fancy casket. Isn't that how he came to you?
Well, I don't know about no fancy casket. He came here in one of them gunmetal gray military-style caskets, and he was in a body bag, sir, inside that casket. That I am sure of.
Okay, so let me get this straight. What you're saying is he came to you in a completely different state than he left Parkland Hospital in?
Well, I don't know where you're getting your information from, but we had one of our men down here, as the pathologist do the Kennedy autopsy.
Yes, I know I have his name. It's Dr. Hume or whatever, but they wouldn't let me speak to him. How many people were in the room during the autopsy?
Well, there was something like maybe 10, 12, 15 people, something like that.
Wow, that's crazy. That is a lot of people. Who was in charge?
Well, I really couldn't tell you who was in charge. I believe maybe one of the admirals that was there was in charge.
Okay, an admiral in charge of an autopsy. That sounds pretty crazy. And pretty stupid. Okay, well, just so I know, what kind of experience does the pathologist have with, gunshot wounds? How many autopsies like this has he done before? I assume it's many. I mean, this is probably the most important autopsy, in history that I can think of.
Yes, Dr. Humes is a good man. He's done 0 autopsies having to do with gunshots.
None. He's never done an autopsy with a gunshot before. Oh my God.
Well, I thought it was kind of strange that the brain was gone when it got here. But, you gotta just trust that everybody's doing the right thing, At a time like this, we just all got to stick together,
Yeah, I guess you're right. Could I get your name real quick?
Absolutely. My name is Harry.
Who cares? You're worthless. Oh my God, this is starting to get frustrating. I don't know about you, but this gimmick is getting very old. For the last call, let's just call the FBI and figure out what they found out about that gun they found on the 6th floor.
FBI, firearms, and ballistics. How can I help you today?
Wow, all your voices sound the same. I know it'd probably be impossible for you to have all of this data on the day that this happened, but we're just going to go with it. What can you tell me about the gun and all the bullets and all that you found during the investigation?
Well, sir, I can tell you a few things. We found the bullet casings for the Mannlicher Carcano rifle on the floor next to the window that he shot the president from. We actually took the gun and we tested it. Unfortunately, it would not fire until we actually manipulated the scope with a few pieces of metal and other things to get it into the right position so that it would be accurate during testing.
Wait a second, you had to manipulate the scope so that it would be accurate?
Yes, sir, you heard me right.
Okay, wait, just so I have this straight. This man fired 3 unbelievable shots at a moving target with a cheap piece of crap rifle that didn't even have the scope tuned to it correctly?
You heard me correctly. I couldn't believe it myself, but he pulled it off. I mean, what a guy, They certainly do teach you how to shoot well when you're in the Marines. I'll tell you that.
Well, I'm not trying to be a dick or anything here, but that's impossible. Like, it's so hard to believe that.
I don't really like your tone. Are you a pinko commie bastard or what? He made those shots. Nothing you can do to change that now. So, go tell all your communist bullshit friends that they can suck my dick. Goodbye, sir.
Wow, that was pointlessly inappropriate. I know I promised that was the last call, but I gotta call the Secret Service just about the limo and make sure, we can look it over and everything like that. Everything's square. So let's just give them a call real quick and we'll be done with this stupid thing.
Secret Service, Agent Bigsby speaking.
Agent Bigsby, just a quick question. The limo, we're gonna have to look that over, for blood spatter, bullet holes, all that stuff. Make sure we get everything right. We're gonna do this investigation right from the start.
I don't know if you're gonna be able to do that. When we brought the limo to the hospital, I grabbed some soapy water in a bucket and I cleaned all the blood off. And then after we did that, we decided it would be in our best interest to get it repaired as soon as possible. So we sent it out of state on an airplane to be fixed and pretty much bring it back to pristine condition, which, you know, that's the way that the presidential limo should be, you know? We don't want it all bloody and full of holes.
Are you crazy? That's a crime scene. Do you know how much information we could have got from that limo alone? You cleaned it and then you sent it out to be repaired? Did you take pictures? Did you do anything? Oh my God.
Well, calm down. We took a couple of pictures, and we found a couple pieces of bullets. I think the FBI has them. Don't you worry, you know. We just wanted it fixed up. You know, we need to move on from this. We have a new president now. Let's just put this unfortunate situation behind us, shall we?
Wow, I can't even believe I'm hearing this.
If you don't mind, I really gotta go. My head is killing me. Me and all them Secret Service boys had quite the night in Fort Worth last night, let me tell you.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Nurse your hangover. Yeah, forget about destruction of evidence and the biggest, most important homicide in American history. Yeah, take some Tylenol. I hope you feel better.
It's not that big a deal.
Man, as you can tell, this is a pretty frustrating investigation so far. Trust me, I want to believe the Warren Commission. I want to believe Lee Oswald acted alone. And I set out originally to prove this. But the more I dug, the more angry and surprised I got. And you can't say that in 1960 investigations were different. They knew how to solve murders and treat crime scenes. They knew that the pathologist can be quintessential in discovery of evidence. But everywhere you look, there are holes, missing and redacted evidence, and outright felony negligence. This should have been handled with such care, and it was so sloppy. This should have been the Super Bowl of investigations. This should have been the World Series of autopsies. It should all be accounted for and well documented. It was treated like the murder of a hooker in a third world country. In a country where you are innocent until proven guilty, and yes, Oswald had some things to explain, he was tried in minutes in Dallas and executed, silenced forever. I don't want to take the time to go over every piece of evidence in the Oswald case right now, but let's just take a look at it psychologically. Let's say he wanted to kill the president. This was not a stupid man, to the contrary, highly intelligent. He joined the Marines at a young age and quickly got a high intelligence clearance. When working in Japan as a radar operator, he was involved in spying on the Russians and the Chinese. He was an expert at radar, photography, and most likely knew how to fly a plane. He was in the Civil Air Patrol. We know he was involved in the O&I and CIA after he left the Marines. The O&I ran a fake defector program where they send spies to Russia pretending to be disenfranchised with capitalism and spy for the agency. Oswald learned how to speak fluent Russian, most likely at an Intel-sponsored school. Let me repeat that. This young man of only 21 learned how to speak Russian so well in a short amount of time, his wife thought he was actually from Russia. After leaving Russia, chances are very good that he was still with the agency. He got involved with the anti-Castro CIA mafia operation. So just to be clear, this was not a stupid, crazy idiot. This was a highly intelligent, high IQ CIA/O&I agent, and wasn't until the day he died. Not to mention, he was starting a family and had 2 young daughters to care for. So let's look at what he did, by all accounts, who believe the Warren Commission's findings. Let's pretend we are planning the shooting ourselves. Okay, we are experienced soldiers and highly intelligent agents of the government, but decide to go against our leader, Commander-in-Chief Kennedy. First, we gotta get a job on the motorcade route in Dealey Plaza. Lucky for us, a friend of the woman our wife is staying with has offered us a job at the Texas School Book Depository. We didn't even have to go looking for a job there. It landed in our lap. Okay, now we need a weapon. I'm thinking we should probably get an extremely high-powered sniper rifle and probably find a way to get a silencer for it from the black market. What did Oswald decide to get for this? A complete piece of junk, Italian-made rifle that cost $12. A rifle that couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. Like I said before, the FBI had to completely manipulate the scope to make it accurate, and even then, they said the iron sights were better. Nevertheless, we use this gun and make some great shots. We leave the bullet casings right next to the window and throw the gun in the corner. Why the hell would we do this? Why not pocket the casings and take a moment to hide the gun, or have a good plan on what to do with it after to remain inconspicuous? Nope, just toss it in the corner where it will be easily found by even a blind policeman. This whole scenario is just not consistent with Oswald, a highly intelligent man with a family to take care of. You can make a whole movie just about Oswald, and I encourage you to look into what I say, because if you're like me, you'll be very surprised. But his backstory being so complicated can help blur the vision of the investigation. Because of the nature of spies, it can send you down a hole you just can't crawl out of. So, Oswald was a spy, so what? Well, it's important. It means he was taking orders right up until the day he died. And because he was a spy, it's very difficult to prove that he is part of the CIA, ONI, or anything else. But it has been proven. Cite this document to anyone who thinks, like I used to, that Oswald was some dumb, crazy ex-Marine with no intelligence ties. This document, sent to the head of Secret Service by the director of the CIA about Oswald, maps out completely what I just told you. Amazing that this is public, and unbelievable this came from one big shot to the other, the heads of their respective agencies. How is this ignored by the Warren Commission and the US media to this day? What kind of crazy shit is going on? Let me narrate this, just so you know what this is. This memorandum was sent to the Chief of U.S. Secret Service from the Director of the CIA, March 3rd, 1964, and was marked confidential. The subject is the Central Intelligence Report on the assassination of John Kennedy. In response to the request made by your office on 24 February 1964 regarding Lee Oswald's activation and assignments on behalf of this agency and Federal Bureau of Investigation, there follows a narrative summary of the internal subversive activities of the Oswald subject. I recommend that unless the Commission makes a specific request for specific information contained herein, that this information not be volunteered. This agency has reason to assume that some junior commission staff members may be potential sources of leaks to the news media or other agencies due to the highly sensitive nature of the enclosed material. It would certainly be in the national interest to withhold it at this time, unless there is, of course, a specific request made. It is my understanding that Mr. Hoover, the head of the FBI, has certain sensitive information within his agency which has been transferred to his own personal files for safekeeping. He concurs that no material should be voluntarily given to the Commission which might affect the status of field operatives or their safety. He is particularly concerned about the D.E. Rui Memorandum, which Central Intelligence has obtained and which I understand you have obtained. It is imperative that this information, at least for the time, remain under wraps. Here's the real heavy hitter. Oswald's subject was trained by this agency under the cover of the Office of Naval Intelligence for Soviet assignments, period. During preliminary training in 1957, subject was active in reconnaissance of mainland China and maintained a security clearance up to the confidential level. His military record during this period are open to your agency, and I have directed that they be forwarded to the Commission. Subject received additional indoctrination at our own illegible site from September 8th to October 17th, 1958, and participated in a few relatively minor assignments until arrangements were made for his entry into the Soviet Union in September 1959. While in the Soviet Union, he was on special assignment in the area of Minsk. It would not be advantageous at this time to divulge the specifics of that assignment. However, if you want this information, it can, and I'm just guessing, be provided for you. The document goes on further to say that they stopped using Oswald after the Russian operation. But even if that is true, it is still admitting that he was in fact trained by the CIA and the ONI, and not just a, quote, crazy ex-Marine, unquote, who went to Russia because he was truly communist and believed in that way of government. And what about the use of these words? I quote from the previous document, "Due to the highly sensitive nature of the enclosed material, it would certainly be in the national interest to withhold it at this time." Withhold evidence that is contrary to what the Commission is to believe? That's not justice. That undermines the entire Warren report. Again, I quote from this previous document. It is my understanding that Mr. Hoover has certain sensitive information within his agency, which has been transferred to his own personal files for safekeeping. He concurs that no material should be voluntarily given to the Commission which might affect the status of field operatives or their safety. He doesn't care about anyone's safety. He cares about the details of Lee Oswald going public. They have to keep him as their boogeyman. And what is the De Bruy memorandum he speaks of, and what did it say? We may never know. It is these brands of secrecy that Kennedy, and before him Truman and Eisenhower, warned us of. Kennedy spoke of official secrecy in a speech to the press, April 27, 1961. It was an amazing speech, and I've cut it down to just a couple of minutes, because I believe it is very important to hear.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. It requires a change in outlook, a change in tactics, a change in missions by the government, by the people, by every businessman or labor leader, and by every newspaper. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. Nevertheless, every democracy recognizes the necessary restraints of national security. And the question remains whether those restraints need to be more strictly observed if we are to oppose this kind of attack as well as outright invasion. But this is a time of peace and peril which knows no precedent in history. It is the unprecedented nature of this challenge that also gives rise to your second obligation, an obligation which I share, and that is our obligation to inform and alert the American people, to make certain that they possess all the facts that they need and understand them as well, the perils, the prospects, the purposes of our program, and the choices that we face. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment.
Okay, I'm a skeptic at times too. Maybe he was talking about communism, but what he has to say applies today and to our country just as much as it did back when he said this. Especially warning of national security, being something to be aware of, but to keep in check. I mean, for God's sake, nowadays the government can track every phone call, text message, and web search of every citizen. And for what? A little security? Does it even really help find the bad guys that much, that often, to sacrifice our liberties and privacy for it? These are questions for another essay, but I just want to bring it to attention before I make the next point. Withholding information and special assassination files for safekeeping equal cover-up, period. So you may ask why and how do they get away with this? How does the media still deny Oswald was a CIA agent? Well, it's a nasty and misunderstood word that explains it pretty well. When I say it, don't get scared and shut this off. Sometimes it sucks, but it's time for some tough love, America. It's like when you're sick and you just gotta tough it out for a few days and get better. So, have you ever looked back at an old advertisement, magazine, or newspaper and been like, wow, people were so stupid back then, how could they have thought like that? Well, here's the real shocker. They weren't stupid. Evolution doesn't work that fast. People were just as smart or dumb back then as they are now. They saw the world through the prism of their current time and through what their environment and media put forward to them. People are like computers. The information they take in is only as good as the information fed into the machine. Nowadays, more than ever, we are so saturated with media that everyone spends most of their time consuming one kind or another. I could spit out some senseless stat, but trust me, most of us spend almost all our time consuming media. Whether it be reading a newspaper, watching a movie, clicking around the internet on your phone, or listening to the radio. It's called programming for a reason. It's made to program the audience. All this media is used together in conjunction to make a beautiful little bubble around you protecting you, called propaganda. Wait, don't be scared. Let me explain. Propaganda sounds like a nasty thing, but everyone has a propaganda bubble around their brain all the time, making you feel safe and happy. Propaganda is a derogatory term, but is essential to being American. It's defined as information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. That's the boring scientific way of describing it, but here's how it really works. Think of it as a filter for a pool. It makes the water you swim in nice and crisp and clean. Yeah, there might be a genocide in the filter of dead frogs, newts, bugs, birds, maybe a squirrel or chipmunk, along with all the other crap you don't want in your pool. Propaganda is a mechanism that makes things seem nice and clean, even when they aren't. People think that the news is always negative stories. But these stories are cleaned up so that they are almost pleasurable. If the news actually showed dead bodies and spoke in a truthful way, you probably wouldn't want to watch it as much, or you might get so upset that you actually might take some kind of action. These news channels would not get the ratings that they do now. For example, it doesn't even matter that the HSBA, the House Select Board on Assassinations, a government panel, found that Kennedy most likely died as a result of a conspiracy back in the 70s. That story is not clean enough for them. It doesn't matter that I just proved beyond any doubt that he was in the ONI and the CIA. The truth upsets the status quo. It makes people uncomfortable and angry. It's like we're in a country full of people in denial, using distractions like reality TV, sports, and cable news, like a narcotic so we don't have to feel. I'm not special. I like watching sports, reality TV, and other random garbage too. But we need to try to see things how they are whenever we can, and investigate things that seem a bit off. We need to do our own investigating and tell our own stories if the corporate media refuses to. But maybe I still haven't convinced you that the story is wrong. I've showed how flawed and sketchy it is, but maybe I need to show you more to drive the point home. There are many items of evidence against Oswald that are overlooked or make no sense at all. Let's look hard at these before I go into what actually happened and all the players involved in this coup d'etat. First, the actual shooting. Since there was no proper crime scene investigation, the clean limo, or autopsy done by unbiased and independent investigators and scientists, along with all the evidence being sent from Dallas to Washington and the FBI, we can't completely prove anything for sure. And that was one of the main reasons why the investigation was botched. So no one's story can be told, and the story against it cannot be easily proven. But we do have some things to work with using common sense, the little evidence that has been released, citizen witnesses, and admitted criminals. During the shooting, as you saw earlier, the president was hit in the throat and in the head. This we can be ironclad sure of. The bullets that were shot by Oswald were supposed to have 6.5mm full metal jacket rounds. These rounds will fragment, but are not designed to. The bullet referred to as the single or magic bullet that allegedly caused one wound to Kennedy, broke Connolly's rib after going through his body, then broke his wrist and embedded in his thigh, would only be possible with a bullet that is made to pass through flesh and bone without exploding or fragmenting. In fact, that bullet is used as a piece of evidence by the Warren Commission and is in near pristine condition. So I asked this question: how is it that the bullet that hit Kennedy in the head completely exploded? It is clear and brutal to see that he was hit with a fragmenting or exploding round. Back in the 60s, many gangsters and assassins would hollow out a bullet's head and fill it with liquid mercury to make it explode on impact, leaving no evidence and assuring a ton of damage. There were many fragments of this bullet in Kennedy's head, and the actual bullet was never found, so we can assume he took the whole shell, absorbing into his skull and brain. Yikes. When the whole back and to the left motion of Kennedy's head is debunked by skeptics, they use the reasoning that the bullet passed through cleanly. Thus the kinetic energy of that missile would have passed through without moving his head a bit. If this were the case, we wouldn't see all the gore and huge chunk of his head flap off, and his poor wife wouldn't have been crawling on the trunk to pick a piece of his scalp up in panic. Since the kinetic energy or inertia of this bullet, probably heading at 3,000 feet per second, did not pass through his head, instead fragmenting and exploding, that energy needed somewhere to go, resulting in his violent head movement. It's not speculation or a conspiracy theory, that is a fact of nature and physics. This shows us two things. First, two different types of bullet must have been used, since all the shells in the sniper's nest are the same, and it is unlikely that you would load one random exploding bullet in with regulars, you would usually use one or the other, and no exploding bullets were left in the clip. We must conclude that there was more than one weapon used. I also came to the conclusion that one shooter was probably an experienced hitman or assassin because he knew to use an exploding round. To drive this home further, since the bullet exploded, causing a back into the left violent movement, we must conclude that the devastating headshot could only have come from the front right. That means two shooters. I couldn't refute this fact as much as I tried. This shatters the lone gunman theory into 1,000 pieces alone. And look, we didn't need a proper autopsy or much ballistics evidence to see that plainly. 90 seconds or less after the shooting, Oswald was run into by a panicked officer. He was looking for suspects, and Oswald was in the break room on the first floor drinking a Coke. The officer said he appeared normal and was not out of breath. In later questioning by the police, he said his break was at noon and he had been there 20 minutes. He could even name the people that saw him there who shared his lunch with, and this was confirmed. So that means if he did the shooting, he ran across the room after, sloppily hid the rifle, ran down 5 or 6 flights of stairs, popped open and started drinking a soda, and caught his breath, again in 90 seconds or less. In addition, there were women who ran down the stairs after the shooting and said nobody was in the stairwell at all. I'm not making this stuff up, it's all there to be found. I was shocked. While we talk about weapons, another surprising thing came to light during my research. Oswald had supposedly shot a policeman dead while he was fleeing to hide at the Texas Theater. When he was arrested, he actually tried shooting the arresting officers, most likely fearing they were there to kill him. More on that later. His handgun made a click sound as he squeezed the trigger. The gun misfired. Later, the gun was tested by investigators and found that it had a defective firing pin, meaning it was unable to fire a bullet. When I looked into this shooting further, the shooting of Officer J.D. Tippit, I found more surprising evidence. Perhaps most importantly, the timing does not add up because Oswald could not have made it to the Tippit shooting unless he got a ride from someone. Why would he get a ride but not to a specific place? Nobody ever came forward saying they gave him a ride, and just to a random street intersection? So we should assume he was on foot, but this wouldn't give him enough time. Then I looked into witnesses. Only one was selected to testify before the Warren Commission. She identified Oswald as the shooter. She also seemed a bit flaky and her testimony would change a bit each interview. The problem with that is, there were multiple witnesses, and they all seemed to see different things. Some saw 2 men, some saw 1 man jump into a car after the shooting. One witness described the shooter as a short, chunky man. Oswald was very skinny and could never be mistaken for fat or chunky. The bullet shells found at the scene were originally ID'd as automatic rounds, but after his arrest it was changed to standard, because Oswald did not have an automatic on him. This is not an easy mistake to make, because experienced officers know to read the bottom of the shell where it plainly says automatic. You're holding the shell in your hand and the radio in the other, and you just blurt out automatic without reading it? Not likely. Oswald's gun was still loaded, but no bullets were found on his person. This means he brought exactly 4 extra bullets with him, discarded the shells after the shooting, then reloaded his gun to full, leaving no bullets in his pocket. That seems implausible. Oswald was put in a police lineup with 4 other men for identification. Witnesses were encouraged to choose one. After all, they were told one of these men, quote, killed the president. Oswald was in casual, torn, and stretched clothes, disheveled, with a black eye. The other men were in suits, looking snappy, and the one question they were all asked was, "Where do you work?" 3 answered that they work for the Dallas police, and Oswald said the book depository. They obviously got these witnesses to ID Oswald with no problem. They did a paraffin test shortly after his arrival at the police station. This can show if you have recently discharged a gun. If he had used a rifle, this would have been on both his hands, cheeks, and arm. The first result was negative. They tested him again and reported that he had it on the palm of his hand. This can mean a few things, but it definitely means he never shot a gun. The positive from his palm could have been from handling books, which have ink that causes a positive result, or he may have handled spent shell casings. And that is only if the test really did come out positive. Last but not least, many people interviewed about Oswald that knew him very well described a kind, intellectual type that liked to keep to himself. They also said that he was not the type to ever have it in him to kill another man. He had a coffee table book about Kennedy, and his acquaintances said that he liked the man. When he was arrested, his mother, who had been labeled crazy by the media, claimed he worked for a government agency, that he was still working for that agency when this happened. Now we know from the document earlier that she was not so crazy after all. He was a US soldier, as well as an ONI and CIA agent. You don't pull that off by being an idiot. After all this, we have to conclude that Oswald was what he said he was. Just a patsy. Now, you must be thinking, enough already about Oswald. You may even still think he did it, and all this is just nonsense. Of course this wasn't a normal investigation of a homicide. Of course JFK had many enemies. Presidents always have many enemies. And most of all, why hasn't anyone ever talked after 50 years? Yep, I asked myself these same questions. That's when I found out that many people actually did talk. People that wanted to go public with their story or crack the investigation often died, usually under suspicious circumstances. Witnesses, law enforcement, investigators, people connected to the assassination in one way or the other, and many more found their way to an early grave. Also, the Mafia has a code of silence that death is the penalty for. Nothing is worse than a rat. And intelligence communities are almost like families themselves, and also have the same code. Some people were told that Castro was actually behind it, and if they came out with any info, it probably would lead to a nuclear war. Nobody wants that on their conscience. We're going back to the beginning of this essay when I talked about secrecy, authority, fear, and, quote, national security. Let's take a look at what happened to many of the people who knew too much. I don't mean to poke fun or marginalize these people at all. They had families and loved ones, and an untimely death is always a tragedy. Some of these deaths may have been of chance, but statistically, that's impossible. Many of them died because of national security. I really think this is one of the saddest parts of this case. Some of them can be considered heroes, and there are more victims that I did not even include. The odds of this happening by chance are just too astronomical. Occam's razor is a scientific philosophy used to determine the explanation of a phenomena. What it states is basically this: all things being equal, the simplest explanation is probably the correct explanation. I think the simplest explanation may be a single crazy guy looking to kill a president because he hates him and thinks he's doing the right thing. But on the other hand, couldn't you use the history of politics over mankind's time for another simple explanation? Our history is filled with powerful people killing other powerful people to further their own interest and power. So I suggest another explanation using Occam's razor. The president was killed by people looking to usurp his power and further their interests. Is this not another simple explanation? In some ways, isn't it even simpler than the lone nut idea? I'm not anti-government at all, but I understand human nature and history and can see this happening throughout time. We like to think the USA is different than other nations in history, but I'm sure the Romans felt the same way about their society. In JFK research, it seems like another case of the people in power stopping intellectuals at the word go by pitting them against each other. Just like black versus white, young versus old, rich versus poor, they pit conspiracy theorists against lone nutters. When I say them, I refer to the power structure that has used this tactic for many, many years. You can stop people from fighting you by getting them to fight one another. A very simple tool of subversive control. We need to put a stop to this pattern by simply taking all the available information that is out there and making a decision on what really happened, instead of snapping at each other and dismissing ideas based on a label. It would be great if we could do this with issues like race and economics, not just the JFK case. In a political assassination in any country, not just ours, the politicians should be the last people to take the word of when it comes to the truth. It is up to the people to keep an eye on our government and take action to correct problems found, not by violence or rioting, but using democracy as it was designed and root out the problem in the voting booth and in peaceful protest. Let's cut to what most assassination researchers want to hear about the most. What really happened that day in Dallas? Who pulled the trigger? Who did they work for, and why? This is where many people who look at this case skew off into their own ideas and usually dismiss others. I have my own idea of what really went down as the motorcade drove through Dealey Plaza. Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA and ONI agent as well as an informant for the FBI. He had infiltrated a misguided and double-crossed anti-Castro assassination group known as Mongoose. Mongoose was an assassination team that was set up to kill Castro, but after the Bay of Pigs, it was given a new assignment, not disbanded. It consisted of CIA and Mafia assassins, as well as foreign contract killers. They had set up a safe house in the Dallas Oak Cliff area. 5 days to a week before the assassination, the key members of Mongoose, as well as local conspirators, were assembled in the safe house to plan an operation called The Big Event. Oswald was not in this safe house, but knew many of the key people that were involved in the operation. He knew this plane was in action, but only knew they were to assassinate him either at the airport where he landed, during the motorcade, or at the Trade Mart he was headed to. Oswald had said as much to his mistress, and most likely to his connection at the FBI, because a teletype, which is an old-school version of an email, warning of the assassination was put out to every FBI office on November 17th. The plan was put into motion by very powerful, high-echelon people in the, quote, alphabet agencies. The plan was put on the table by Lyndon Johnson and his close friend J. Edgar Hoover, who both despised the Kennedys. These two men were instrumental in the cover-up, and they were probably most responsible for the assassination. They got the ball rolling with Allen Dulles, who had just lost his official title with the CIA, but still had strong connections in the CIA community, and of course Mongoose. Another surprising person, who would become very powerful in the CIA and the USA later, was a recruiter and financier for these anti-Castro agents, and used his offshore drilling company as a front, named George Bush. The safe house in Dallas was a meeting and planning base for the operation for those who would be involved in the assassination itself. They knew that there was a patsy set up to take the blame, and as long as they kept their mouths shut, they would get paid, and the cover-up would be taken care of by the bigwigs in Washington. I know this sounds wild, but the project that brought us a nuclear bomb 20 years earlier was much more complex, involved more people, and was much harder to achieve than a simple assassination. And the US pulled that off without a hitch. This was long before this happened in Dallas. In a strange way, Kennedy was taken out by a powerful social network. These people were more than just associates, they were close friends as well. They trusted each other and knew what needed to be done to keep their power. Clint Murchison was an oil billionaire whose wealth was made in the oil business, nurtured and preserved by the oil depletion allowance, which Kennedy was to change. He owned about 500 different companies and controlled just about everything and anything in Texas. He extended his influence to Washington, D.C. and other powerful venues through a very special hotel that he ran, the El Charro Hotel in California. This was an expensive luxury vacation resort, and Murchison used it to bond with and wine and dine the most important people in the underworld and Washington. The frequent guests were all power figures like J. Edgar Hoover, Carlos Marcello, who was the head of the New Orleans Mafia, Richard Nixon, Bobby Baker, who was Johnson's right-hand man and Secretary of the U.S. Senate, and a wealthy man named D.H. Byrd, who was the owner of the Texas Book Depository. All these men had motive and opportunity to make this assassination happen. In fact, on the eve of the assassination, Clint Murchison had a very big party at his house in Texas with some very interesting guests. These include Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Byrd, and other oil billionaires, as well as the guest of honor, J. Edgar Hoover, who flew in just for the party, then flew back to Washington. When Lyndon Johnson arrived, they all disappeared into what we can consider a smoke-filled room, and a meeting was held. According to Johnson's mistress at that time, Johnson came out of the meeting and grabbed her arm, then whispered into her ear, "After tomorrow, those motherfucking Kennedys will never make a fool out of me again. That's not a threat, that's a promise." Hoover flew back to Washington, well aware of his role, knowing the next day if things went well, his good friend Lyndon Johnson would be the president and he could keep his job. Of course, Kennedy would have forced Hoover's retirement in 1964. These reports come from Murchison's housekeepers, cooks, and Johnson's mistress, who would have nothing to gain by making this story up. So now we have all the pieces on the board, ready to make a big move on the 22nd. Kennedy knew it was a big risk to go to Texas, but he had no idea that he was headed into a turkey shoot with his protection stripped away completely. The Secret Service were hung over and ordered off the back of the presidential limo, and the Dallas police motorcycle cops were ordered to ride behind the president instead of next to him. They also went from 4 to 6 motorcycles on the sides of the limo to 2 motorcycles 10 feet behind it. The Secret Service also ordered the Dallas police to be taken off the motorcade route, and no crowd control was in effect at all. In a normal motorcade, the president would be somewhere in the middle, but today, it was the lead car, completely opening him up from the front. He had no protection from the front, the sides, or the rear. These are all giant mistakes, and a huge break of protocol. The media was forced back in the motorcade as well. Ever wonder why the only people that got photos or video of the event were citizens? This was no accident. The limo proceeded down Main Street, greeting by cheering citizens. Even without police or Secret Service protection, everyone was happy and peaceful. Then the limo made a turn onto Houston Street and approached Dealey Plaza. This was the planned kill zone. Lee Oswald was finishing his lunch in the break room and opening a Coke. The next few moments would change the country and the course of history forever. At the safe house, they decided that 4 shooter teams would make sure that the job got done. I'm going to speculate a bit on the names of the shooters, but remember that this is only based on inference. Conspirator David Ferry had acquired 4 special Motorola radios for communication that are normally used in railroad yard communication. They operate on a low frequency, which is not monitored. Dealey isn't a very large area, so even 4 was almost overkill, but they didn't want to take any chances that he would survive. Team 1 would be the Texas School Book Depository team. Cover for getting them in the building and on the 6th floor was that they were resurfacing the floors of the building. The 6th floor was scheduled for the 22nd through Byrd, and that team would consist of Mac Wallace as the shooter with a high-powered accurate rifle, along with 1 radio man / spotter. This was so the sound would mostly come from the Texas School Book Depository and set up the patsy. The next team was the South Knoll team, with the best riflemen, either Lucien Sarti or a military sniper with a silenced, high-power sniper rifle, and his radio man and spotter, Jack Ruby. He would shoot first and try to get a clean headshot, then retreat immediately whether he was successful or not. Ruby would take the weapon and flee, and the assassin would slip away. Third team was the Dal Tex team. This team was the radio / command team, alerting others by saying go or abort in the radios when the firing should start, as well as another signal for the headshot. They also were in possession of a silenced rifle so that the whole building would not be alerted. This team was John Roselli and Charles Nicoletti. Nicoletti was the shooter and Roselli the radio man. The final team was the cleanup crew on the grassy knoll. This team would only fire if there had not been a headshot and was the final line of defense, or offense. This would consist of a shooter with an unsilenced, short-barreled rifle for maximum velocity and power, and a hollow-point exploding round. The rifle could also quickly be disassembled or concealed. For cover, this team will have 2 fake Secret Service agents, or Dallas police, to keep the area clear before and after the event, and to collect any incriminating photos or videos immediately following it. I believe that the shooter was either James Files, the Chicago gangster, or another hitman from Chicago. Fake agents were either mob or CIA, and I won't speculate on their names. They would also aid the shooter in escape. This team did not need or have a radio, because the shooters and agents would not be too close to each other, and they had the best view. Fourth radio would be held by a signaler next to the firing zone, who can be seen holding his hand up in the Zapruder film. In the end, things didn't go perfectly to plan, and the grassy knoll team did have to fire, but the president was hit in the head, and Connolly was not killed, and that was a success. Now I'll show a short, crude animation of what I believe were the shots during the motorcade. This explains every wound, includes 3 audible shots, and if the Daltech's gun was not silenced, would include 5 shots. This would match both the witness reports and the official story of 3 shots, as well as the audio evidence of 5 shots from the stuck radio microphone. There were 2 main barrages of fire. The first shot from the south knoll went through the windshield and struck the president in the throat. This shooter then retreated because he was to only fire once, and his field of fire would be obstructed from this point on anyways. He threw the weapon to Jack Ruby, who was seen by an off-duty officer, sliding down the back of the triple underpass, throwing a gun into his car, and driving off towards Fort Worth. The next shot came from the Daltech's building, just a short moment after, and missed completely or nicked the top of the limo, then struck a curb and injured bystander James Tague. Then Wallace fired from the book depository and struck Kennedy in his back near his right shoulder blade. This was the first barrage, and afterwards, while the Daltech's and Texas School Book Depository shooters reloaded and re-aimed, the limo began to slow, and the driver looked back at Kennedy, who had grasped his throat. Secret Serviceman Clint Hill began heroically running towards the limo after hearing the shot from the book depository. This is when the second barrage began. The grassy knoll cleanup shooter had not yet seen a headshot, so he started squeezing the trigger. The Daltech shooter fired and hit Kennedy in the back of the head, and the grassy knoll shooter hit him in the right side of the head just a millisecond later, exploding it and sending blood and bone towards the trunk of the limo. The Texas Book Depository shooter shoots just a fragment of a second later, missing Kennedy again and striking Connolly in the back, going through his body, breaking a rib, and the fragments embedded into his wrist and thigh. Then the limo speeds off to Parkland. This theory explains as much as possible in the simplest manner. There may have been more shooters, more shots, but this explains so much that I would conclude this is much more likely than just one man with a terrible rifle shooting from the book depository, or even 2 men, one in the depository and one on the grassy knoll.
Good evening, fellow Americans. As you have learned, I was killed by a conspiracy of corruption and men seeking power. Of this, there can be little doubt. So what now? What can we do? Is there any solution? Well, that's difficult. It is difficult when you find out that the country you love has been taken over and changed right under the nose of the people. It is very interesting that Americans don't see why their country was so special. What is the role of a government? Some think it is to provide for you. This is where the thinking of the people is so very flawed. I used to wonder why people were so eager to flee their land and start new in America. I now know they did not come here for security. They came here for liberty. If you want things provided for you by the government and have lots of security, That is very easy to get. You can get sleeping quarters, 3 meals a day, various forms of entertainment, a place to exercise, people who are armed and alert at all times to keep security and a roof over your head. Sounds good, doesn't it? Like paradise on earth, or some grand utopia. Well, I'm talking about a jail. The path of our society is headed in a very grave direction. This change is not necessarily going to happen rapidly, but instead a slow erosion, gradual, to the point you will not even notice it's happening. Like picking the leaves off the tree of liberty, one at a time, until the tree can no longer breathe and falls to the ground. During the 19th and early 20th century, when our government was small and stayed out of the way of free enterprise and free thinking, the United States was the leader of the world in technology, economy, freedom, and quality of life. This prosperity lasted a time, but it has, like a large wave crashing on the beach, begun to slowly drift backwards into a sea of poverty, sadness, debt, crime, and fascism. The only way to fix what happened on November 22nd, 1963, is to fix the problem that caused it, and to restore our politics to its constitutional root. Our national security state needs to be eviscerated. The executive branch needs to be put back in check with the legislation and judicial branches. No more intelligence agencies acting without oversight of the citizens. No more undeclared wars or police actions, and no more assassinations of anybody in any country we have not declared war with. We must put an end to lifetime professional politicians through a law enacted that you can only serve in the U.S. government for a maximum of 8 years and may not be a career politician. The NSA, CIA, FBI, and Homeland Security need to be disbanded or dissolved. Before we go thinking that's too radical, remember that we did just fine without them for over 150 years, and they have proved to do more harm than good, and are responsible for my death and the death of scores of others. Policing will be done on a local level only, with no military intervention or assistance as set forth by our forefathers. Any issues regarding interstate crime will be dealt with through collaboration of these local law enforcement agencies, through advanced technology, and the Attorney General of the United States. The Patriot Act rescinded, and another bill put in its place, restoring the full privacy of all U.S. citizens. Every student in public schools must learn the Constitution by 5th grade, as well as why it was written and how it is applied. No president, congressman, judge, or anyone acting along with or on behalf of those persons can belong to any secret organization, secret society, spy or security agency of any kind, or political committee or lobby. Politicians should be drawn from the private sector with experience in management and getting tasks accomplished efficiently, as well as teachers, scientists, doctors, and laborers, instead of manufactured politicians acting as puppets on behalf of outside powers. Being in politics needs to go back to being something that is done out of service and love of the country, and not as a career, with these elected persons representing a cross-section of the actual citizens of this country. The companies that supply weapons for the government need to be privatized, downsized, and or eliminated. Weapons manufacturers and workers in that industry will get financially assisted for a period of time, and the equipment used to manufacture all these weapons will be bought by the U.S. government from these companies at full value and destroyed or put to use in a less destructive manner. Any stationing or movement of troops or agents of the U.S. government of any kind in foreign lands must be voted on and approved by the House and Senate, and approved by the President and Supreme Court. Science and technology needs to be opened up, and any single method of science or scientific recipe used in the marketplace for profit, with medicine, electronics, automotives, or otherwise, must be revealed to any party in the United States interested in learning that method or technology for their own applications. In other words, you cannot patent an idea or formula, but you can patent a product. This would result in a boom of jobs and less monopolies, as well as lower prescription costs and better medicines developed much faster. And finally, to end the endless debt cycle of the people, the Federal Reserve put to an end, and the U.S. Treasury once again printing money backed up by precious metals. The process of this change will be difficult because those who have a grip on power in this country will resist these changes. We must recognize that our manufactured career politicians have shown time and time again that they are not right for the job. In closing, love your family, love your friends, spread peace and joy, and also love your country before it is lost forever. Because we must remember, it is easy to stop a single man in a motorcade, but impossible to stop millions who are not afraid.
This part of the film is going to be a little different. The essay itself has concluded, but like I had said before, I was avoiding naming names. The reason for that is it can be very confusing when you start doing that. I noticed a lot of JFK assassination documentaries, books, etc. You know, they'll name all these names and it seems to make sense, and then there's just so much that it's overwhelming. And as you can see, just by looking at these connection lines, you know, this is a crazy web of different things going on. It's actually not quite as complicated as it seems here. So basically what we have here, like I said, is a mind map. This is the Wizard of Oswald JFK assassination mind map. I'm gonna move probably in like kind of clockwise or something direction and just go through pretty much the whole map. You're looking at the reason right here that it's so easy just to put it on one man. It makes it nice and simple. You know, Lee Harvey Oswald did it, and that's it. Look at what it takes to actually figure out what went down. Probably the biggest character other than Lyndon Johnson would be this man, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, of course. And as you can see, he is connected with a lot of lines to a lot of people. Like I described earlier, he was at the party on the eve of the assassination at Clint Murchison's house, and I'm just going to zoom out a bit so we can see where else he connects. Of course, him and Lyndon Johnson are good friends, very trusting of each other. They both hated Kennedy. So, you know, he was basically the guy that really made it possible for this to really go down without a hitch. He was also connected, as we can look here. We'll follow this blue line here. Allen Dulles in the CIA. And under Allen Dulles, we're going to have a whole lot of people to go over. But, you know, Allen Dulles was a huge part of making this all happen. J. Edgar Hoover also had a lot of connections with the mafia. He would, you know, he would party with Carlos Marcello here at the hotel, the Charo. Sam Giancana was a huge character in the mafia back then. He was the head of the Chicago area, and J. Edgar Hoover was definitely familiar with him. He also was in contact with the Secret Service, the head of the Secret Service, James Rowley. Here's another connection that Hoover had at his disposal. One of the only other men that I could really name that were in the FBI itself was James Hosty. He was at the Dallas FBI agency, and he is connected to Oswald directly. Oswald actually gave him a note before the assassination went down, and it was destroyed. Hosty says that the note basically said, "Stop bothering my wife," but I would wager the guess that it probably said something else more damaging, because why else would you destroy it? I mean, why destroy evidence unless it's gonna screw you over somehow? But, you know, the biggest connection with Hoover here is well, when it comes to the cover-up, is all of the evidence that was collected by the Dallas police went directly, like that night, to Washington and to Hoover and to the FBI. They had all the evidence. So basically, they controlled the investigation right from the start. Took it out of the Dallas police's hands, and after Oswald was murdered by Ruby, they really didn't have a case to worry about in Dallas. Let's go to Lyndon Johnson. Now, we already talked about how Lyndon Johnson was in trouble. He was actually involved in a scandal with Bobby Baker. They were probably both going to go to jail. Once he became president, that pretty much went away. But the big players with Lyndon was his attorney, Edward Clark, Bobby Baker, which was like his protege, Cliff Carter. He was the money man. He was kind of the guy who laundered. He was the guy who got Lyndon the cash and distributed cash among this group. Mac Wallace, basically, he was going to be one of our main shooters. He was the Texas School Book Depository shooter, and the reason that I say that is he had a fingerprint that was found on a box in the Texas School Book Depository in the sniper's nest that was completely confirmed to be his. He's dead. Okay, we're going to move over here. This is the Texas connection. These were the guys that wanted to get rid of Kennedy because the oil depletion tax allowance was going to be taken away, which basically means they got a 25% tax break on taxes for their oil, and basically it helped make them the millionaires there were. H.L. Hunt and Clint Murchison Sr. were two of the richest Americans at the time, right up there with Sid Richardson. These are very, very wealthy people that wanted to keep that wealth. They wanted to see Kennedy go. John Connally, obviously the governor of Texas, he was in the car when the president was shot. He was, you know, big time with Lyndon Johnson. D.H. Byrd, big player in this. Basically, D.H. Byrd founded the Civil Air Patrol. Now, if you ever seen JFK or done any research in the Garrison case, the Civil Air Patrol, Oswald was in it, Roscoe White, who we'll talk about shortly, David Ferry was in it, and another person we'll talk about in a while named John Liggett was in the Civil Air Patrol, and this guy was the head of it. Now, interestingly, D.H. Byrd also owned the the Texas School Book Depository, which is quite interesting. And of course, Clint Murchison, who had, the party before the assassination, and after the hit was pulled off, it was champagne and caviar for the next week at his mansion. And Sid Richardson, another big-time oil guy who definitely profited from losing JFK. Another connection to these men, the Hotel del Charo, and Carlos Marcello from the Mafia. He spent time there. So there's your connection with Lyndon. There's your connection with the oil men who Lyndon actually told his mistress were the ones that made this all go down, that caused the hit on Kennedy. When she was asking him, were you involved? Lyndon said, oh, it was all those oil guys. We've got Mac Wallace, and you'll notice this red dotted line means that they were probably in Dallas, probably at the safe house, and were involved with what is called the big event, which was kind of the code name for the Kennedy assassination. So Mac Wallace was definitely there. He's got the purple line, which also means that I believe he was a shooter. Another interesting character is Leon Jaworski. He was actually an advisor, and he was involved with the Warren Commission. Now, Leon Jaworski is also connected to some interesting people. He was connected to the Bush family. He was an attorney for them. He was good friends with Lyndon Johnson. He also was connected to, of course, George Bush Sr. and Richard Nixon. The Secret Service, I wouldn't completely put the whole thing on them, but good Lord, did they screw up. I mean, if they weren't complicit, and I believe these guys here at the top knew what was to happen. James Rowley, I believe he knew. He was close with J. Edgar Hoover. Emory Roberts was the man who called the agents off the limo. If you've seen that famous video of the guy waving the Secret Service men away from the limo at the beginning of the motorcade when they were at Love Field, that was Emory Roberts. I think he knew, at least he was told to keep the people off the motorcade. William Greer, he was the driver, looks very guilty, especially in the Normalize Zapruder film. Roy Kellerman was the man in the passenger seat. I don't know if these guys were just hungover because they partied in Fort Worth, which is pretty disgusting. In my opinion, everybody in the Secret Service should have got fired for that alone. I mean, you're not supposed to drink on the job to begin with. And second of all, when you guys were all hungover, you let the goddamn president get killed. The people in the big banking industries, these were some of the richest Americans there were. Harriman, who has connections, even though I forgot to connect him to him, he has connections to J. Edgar Hoover. He was in the Council on Foreign Relations. He was in Kennedy's cabinet. Kennedy got really angry with Harriman after the whole Bay of Pigs thing went down. Prescott Bush was in business with Harriman at the time, and he also was in business with Henry Neil Mallon. And Henry Neil Mallon hooked up with Prescott Bush's son, George Bush Sr., and started Zapata Offshore, which seems like a harmless enough thing, an offshore drilling company, but these guys were actually a front for Operation Mongoose and Operation 40, which is here. And like I said before, Operation Mongoose, Operation 40 basically were Castro killing operations. And this whole thing really is just a Castro killing operation backfired on Kennedy. We're going to move over here to the Dallas police and how they connect to everything. Will Fritz, he was told by Hoover, I basically just drew Hoover to Dallas police because he just owned them. He got all the evidence, and they basically told Curry, Fritz, Wade, everybody, Earl Cabell, the mayor, basically pinned it on Lee Harvey Oswald from the start said, "You got your man." Will Fritz, I believe, knew that Jack Ruby was going to assassinate Oswald. If you watch the video of him in the garage, you can see he barely reacts when Oswald is shot. The Tippit shooting. Basically, one of our main players, and some people would probably dispute this, but I find a lot of interesting things connecting to Roscoe White as being a main character in this saga. Basically, Roscoe White was in the Civil Air Patrol. He was in the O&I. I believe he was at the safe house. He's connected to a lot of things. He's also connected to the CIA. I believe he was somewhere. The CIA is tough to figure out. Obviously, they're a secret organization, but I think he might have been in conjunction somewhere with Nixon. And I believe he was the man who actually shot Tippit to put the APB out on Lee Harvey Oswald. I believe Lee Harvey Oswald and J.D. Tippit over here, who both were O&I, along with Roscoe White, and Roscoe White had actually served in the Marines. Probably there's pictures of him with Oswald in the Marines. So, he knew Oswald. I believe Tippit was O&I. There's evidence to show that. And basically, Tippit had to die. I mean, I think he wasn't involved in it and knew too much. So he kind of had to go, and they messed the hit up on Oswald. He was probably supposed to die very shortly after. He slipped him and made his way to the theater. Roscoe White could even have been a shooter. If he was a shooter, I believe he could have been behind the picket fence close to the overpass and might have fired the deadly headshot. Okay, we've got the Mafia involvement here. Now, the Mafia don't have a lot of stuff, coming off of them. But what you got to remember is all of these three, they pretty much were the heads of the country. Sam Giancana was the Chicago outfit, which had a control over most of the North. Marcello, even though he's known as the New Orleans mob boss, Marcello, he owned pretty much all of the South, the Southwest, from Las Vegas and LA all the way over to New Orleans. Santos Traficante was a big Miami guy, and I believe there was actually a few hits on Kennedy that fell through. One was supposed to go down in Chicago, one was supposed to go down in Miami, but they were called off for different reasons. So you've got a lot more people when that happens that could be connected because they might have been involved in an earlier plot that got changed. Now, Johnny Roselli and Charles Nicoletti have been, placed in Dealey Plaza. They were definitely in Texas. James Files and Gary Marlowe. These two are tough. I'm not sure if I believe James Files completely. I think he might be telling somebody else's story. It's pretty hard to deny how truthful he appears. But you got to remember that this guy, he's been in and out of jail, and he's a bad guy. I mean, bad guys lie, and who knows, what his reasoning for that would be. And you'd think because Roselli was killed, Nicoletti was killed, why did they let the actual grassy knoll gunman live? It's just questions you got to wonder about. And Files also implicated this guy Gary Marlowe over here as being the person who actually killed Tippit, which conflicts with some other ideas, evidence, and theories. So you can take it for what it's worth. He's definitely got an interesting story, and you can't find it. Another thing that bothers me about Files is the man who sells the interview with him, I guess. Okay, let's see. These are I actually connected 4 people to the shooters. I'll go over those in a little bit. This is where the CIA gets their fingerprints all over this thing. This is the big event. This is either the planning of the event or these people were at the safe house. The reason I said the CIA has their fingerprints all over this whole thing, is just take a look at this. I mean, insanity. I did my best to try to group these guys in the order of command or whatever, but we're talking about We're talking about a completely secret, these are all secret agents, you know, this is a secret organization. So you got to go off the hard research of all the people that came before you. You know, I mean, imagine if somebody could have looked at this chart back in 1963, it would have blown their mind. So I'm just going to start from the top, I guess, and work my way from right to left. Well, Allen Dulles, obviously, he was a CIA chief. Kennedy fired this man and told him he was going to split his organization into 1,000 pieces, scatter it to the wind, basically disband the CIA. He was very angry about Operation Mongoose, the Bay of Pigs, all that stuff going south, how heavy right-wing these guys are. A lot of these men, you got to take it, you know, into account the way people thought back in the 60s, especially, and some people even today. I hate to put it this way, but a lot of these people were like Nazis. You know, heavy nationalist, right-wing, anti-civil rights. You know, it depends on your political beliefs, but these guys were closer to Nazis than you would believe, and I think that's why Kennedy saw evil in them and wanted to get rid of the organization. Cord Meyer, one of the major guys involved in the assassination, because I think he got the order from LBJ, or the go-ahead, or he's the one that LBJ contacted to get the ball rolling. I don't think he necessarily went to Dulles because he knew Cord Meyer. I believe he just went straight to Cord Meyer and had Cord Meyer start to set this up. Now, at the same time, I want you to keep in mind that George Bush Sr. was in the CIA back then, and you know, I don't rush to blame him just because he's a Bush. I actually make the statement because he became the director of the CIA and he became the president of the United States. So you don't just get that in this group of people for nothing, as well as a document that puts him in Dallas on November 22nd. So, I mean, I could have even put him at the safe house. You know, I don't even know if he necessarily was in on the big event, but probably. Yeah, so we got Cord Meyer here. So I'm just going to go through the people that I believe Cord Meyer was connected to. So you've got Cord Meyer, I believe, connected to a man, Jake Esterline, another CIA agent, and Clay Shaw. And this was more of the New Orleans, Jim Garrison type deal with David Ferry. These are the guys that were overheard plotting to kill JFK. And a huge player in this whole game, and another guy who I would consider one of the major people responsible for not just JFK but his little brother getting killed, is a man named David Morales from the CIA, who I believe had underneath him Jake Miranda, you know, Del Valle, Mackenzie, Michael Victor Mertz, or Michel, these are French gangster who could have possibly in the safe house are involved, but I really don't have enough to be absolutely sure. I do know that he got special treatment. He got some kind of CIA airlift out of Dallas, so he was in the area. Herminio Diaz, I think this guy was either a shooter or he was the man in the Zapruder film holding his arm in the air. Jake Miranda was a handler for a lot of other CIA guys, but David Morales, I believe, was in Dealey Plaza, may have been a shooter, definitely involved, definitely part of the plot. Bill Harvey, who was looking to make a name for himself in the agency. Underneath him, we have Charles Harrison, Percy Holt, Charles Rogers. These are two of the three tramps. Chauncey Holt, I believe, was kind of caught by surprise and thought that it was an abort, a CIA abort. He thought that the hit was called off, which I believe was a misinformation thing done within the CIA with some of their own agents so that they could have plausible deniability. Big guy, Lucien Sarti, he was involved in the French drug trafficking. He was a big-time assassin. He was, one of my guesses, a South Knoll shooter. Has connections, Corsican Mafia, and I believe he has connections with Santos Traficante. Probably was going to be involved in Miami, and when it didn't happen in Miami, he was in Dallas. Richard Nixon, huge, big-time, big event planner. I believe he was right up at the top with, you know, George Bush, David Atlee Phillips. under Nixon was E. Howard Hunt. You could take a big chunk of these guys and you've got your Watergate. A lot of these guys were involved in Watergate, that whole mess. It's a whole nother subject, but these names should sound familiar if you're familiar at all with the Watergate scandal. David Atlee Phillips was most likely Oswald's CIA handler. George de Mohrenschildt, he was under David Atlee Phillips, possibly under James Jesus Angleton. But basically, he was the one that was watching over Oswald during the whole sheep dip, getting him set up as being a perfect patsy. I don't believe they knew for sure what they were going to use Oswald for. He was just connected to so much that they needed to do something with him. He basically was the patsy and was killed. James Angleton, he actually is a counterintelligence chief. James Angleton was big on killing Dorothy Kilgallen. He was actually caught in her friend's apartment stealing papers and notes that Kilgallen had given her. I believe he was working under Richard Bissell and also was connected with Charles Cabell and Richard Helms. Charles Cabell also lost his job when Kennedy got rid of Dulles. You know, pretty much all these guys that you're looking at here were in jeopardy of losing their stance in the power structure of the United States if Kennedy just kept going. They believed that they were doing the right thing by getting rid of Kennedy. They, in their, twisted logic, thought that they were doing the right thing for our country. Of course, Ruth Paine have linked her or her husband to the CIA, probably to de Mohrenschildt, who kind of passed the Oswalds off to Ruth Paine, and Ruth Paine got him the job at the Texas School Book Depository. While we were scanning over him, Jack Ruby had his hands all over this whole thing. He was involved with so much that they basically told him, you guys screwed up, Oswald wasn't supposed to make it. Oswald doesn't get taken out, you're gonna go down. You can either be a hero, killing Oswald, or we'll probably end up having to kill you. He owned the Carousel Club in Dallas. He was connected to so much. One of the most interesting connections, I believe, is his connection to Nixon, because there's a document where Richard Nixon actually prevented Ruby from testifying for Congress because he was an informant for the FBI. So that connects him to Nixon, that connects him to the FBI. He's also connected to de Mohrenschildt. He was also connected to David Ferry. He was also connected to the Mafia. He used to work for Sam Giancana. He met with Johnny Roselli and Charles Nicoletti shortly before the assassination. He obviously knew Carlos Marcello and was involved with him when he was in New Orleans, because he had both the New Orleans and a Dallas connection. All of the Dallas police used to go to his club, drink for free, get all the girls and gamble and just have a friggin' hell of an old time. So he was connected with them. And of course, the man who I keep going back to as a very interesting person, Roscoe White, who his fingerprints are all over this whole thing, obviously. He was actually killed in an explosion. Okay, we've gone over Ruby. Since we're in this area now, I'm going to talk about the Warren Commission. Now, the Warren Commission, it's the worst fraud of this whole thing. It's just a joke, really. Anybody that investigates this case and believes this crap and, looks at the evidence itself and buys their conclusion that one single person pulled this off, has been completely turned around. But I'm going to go through these guys. David Bellin, he had a dream, and he told Arlen Specter about this, that he basically had a dream about the single bullet theory. He said, I figured it out, because they couldn't figure out how they were going to explain all these wounds. And he told Arlen Specter about it. That's how he got the single bullet theory. Hale Boggs here, he didn't want to be involved in this. He got blackmailed into getting into this whole thing. He didn't agree with it, and he disappeared long after. He always said he regretted putting his name to it, or signing his name to it. Richard Russell, when I was talking about Nazis, this guy was super anti-civil rights, hated the blacks, and you know, it was all about, you know, segregation and all that messed up crap, and a lot of these guys are. Gerald Ford, he was planted in there by Hoover. He was a buddy of Richard Nixon. He was setting himself up to be a future president by going along with all this crap, and it worked out. He did become president. Earl Warren, he was also blackmailed by Hoover into going into this. Hoover had the dirt on everybody, everyone. The mob had the dirt on Hoover. That's why he always said that he didn't believe there even was a mafia in the United States. He was around for the golden era of the mafia when everybody pretended they didn't exist, until, you know, the Kennedys came around and Bobby started putting them all in jail. He had some kind of dirt on Earl Warren, and he made him the head of the commission, or he put his name on the commission because people trusted Earl Warren. Another anti-civil rights guy, John McCloy, he actually, I believe he was either the architect or he was somehow involved with the Japanese internment camps, which is pretty disgusting thing that happened during World War II. You know, these are really great guys to be heading up an investigation into the killing of JFK, aren't they? I mean, look at these characters. John Cooper is with the Bushes, definitely connected to the CIA, connected to Harriman, the big banker, you know, the whole skull and bones crap. He was in tight with those guys. So basically, we've got the Fox investigating the hen house, which I'm stealing that line from something, but you don't want these guys. If John Kennedy was to pick a commission to determine what really happened in his assassination, these type of people would be the last people he would have chosen. Now, cover-up is just as big a deal as the whole thing itself, because if there was no cover-up, then these people, they would have got what they deserved. But there was a cover-up, obviously. Warren Commission was the biggest part of the cover-up. Zoom out a bit here. After World War II, CIA, as you can see they're connected here, the CIA started Mockingbird, which is basically using the press to control the people of the United States, what kind of information that they get, kind of control what we think. I could say brainwashing, but that, you know, that's kind of harsh, but that's kind of what they were planning on doing with this. The media, Time Life magazine back in the early 60s was huge in implicating Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone gunman. The famous cover photo of him holding the rifle pretty much convicted him in the eyes of the people. And Time Life at that time's publisher was this man here named C.D. Jackson. Now, he was head of psychological operations for the OSS, which basically means a propagandist. So you've got kind of a secret agency type guy. This isn't some independent media. This is a guy that is part of PSYOPs and was connected to the CIA, because the OSS basically became the CIA. And he's the guy who publishes Time Life. Interestingly, they're the ones that got the Zapruder film. They held it back for 12 years. They altered it. It's pretty obvious to see that. So they're pretty culpable in this whole thing. Quickly, I wanted to look at the cover-up as far as the autopsy. If you look at this picture, I call it the creepy cartoon, because if you look at it, I mean, there is nothing scientific at all about this. This is disgusting that they could pass this on to us and we would accept it. Have you ever seen any scientific image that looks like this? This is a Looney Tune, disgusting, filthy, horrible image. This is hanging up in the museum on the 6th floor at Dealey Plaza. A picture like this. So this was disgusting, and then they tried to make it a little better. This was the House Select Board on Assassinations photo. Now, all the doctors at Parkland Hospital talked about how the parietal occipital bone, I mean, I'm trying to remember the exact way you say it, but basically this bone here in the back of the skull, which you can actually kind of see in this picture, was completely blown out. This picture shows bone on the top of his head somehow flying off from a shot from behind, which is a lie. It's ridiculous. But the Parkland's doctors, the guys that first saw it, drew this sketch. I mean, even this, though this is really crude, at least it's accurate. I mean, this is what they saw. The back of his head blown the hell out. I mean, why would all these doctors in Dallas lie? The parietal occipital bone is gone. Flew out the back onto the trunk. That's what Jackie Kennedy was crawling out there to grab, was pieces of brain matter. It's really sad. But This is the initial report and the true report, and then we get these Looney Tune disgusting pictures that show his face drawn, and it's just disgusting. And the mainstream news to this day has been pushing the Warren Report theory. And the only thing you gotta think about with that is, don't be surprised, they're owned by a corporation. Corporations own them. All the money is in the people that want to keep this crap under wraps. The last part of the cover-up we're going to talk about is the more modern cover-up. These two guys here are your talking heads for the cover-up. Gerald Posner, who wrote a book. It's called Case Closed. I read some of it. It's kind of just backwards talk and spin, which is what Vincent Bugliosi also does. But Gerald Posner has been accused of, and I believe it was proved, that he was a plagiarist and had falsificated quotes. So basically that means copying other people's work word for word and making up words out of people's mouth that never happened. So you gotta wonder, why would he want to push this story? And I found it interesting that he was in the same fraternity, Phi Beta Kappa. He was in the same fraternity as Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and good old, down here, Richard Helms. So I thought that was interesting. The main reason to go along with the Warren Report would be to make money, because the mainstream media needs somebody out there with some kind of credibility that actually believes that crap, will spin and talk about it as if it's real. The other guy who's big on that is the former Los Angeles District Attorney. I call him the King of Spin, Vincent Bugliosi. His book has convinced many people that the Warren Commission got it right. Oswald acted alone. His book was called Reclaiming History, and they based the new motion picture that just came out, Parkland, off of his work. If there's one person that knows how to twist the truth, it's an attorney. They know how to tell you, they can spin anything into something believable. And one of his favorite quotes was, "There is no credible evidence to show that anyone other than Lee Harvey Oswald did this." Well, there's no credible evidence because it was destroyed. There's no credible evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald did it. So if you want to talk about credible evidence, there is no credible evidence to be found anywhere. And that you can blame on Mr. Hoover over here, because Mr. Hoover destroyed, redacted evidence. He got all the evidence. This whole thing was hooked up by him. I think that's it. The last thing to go over are the actual shooters. These are just my conjectures, but based on a lot of research. Charles Nicoletti, kind of pinning him as the Dell Tex guy. Mac Wallace, Texas School Book Depository shooter. Got a nice zoom in on him so you can see what he looks like. This is Malcolm Mac Wallace. He also was responsible for other murders, Lyndon Johnson, other hits that he had put out. Lyndon Johnson even got his own sister killed. I mean, he's a pretty nasty guy. Let's go over here to the CIA shooters. Lucien Sarti, the French assassin, believe he was a shooter. Herminio Diaz may have been a shooter. Over here, James Files claims to be a shooter. He says he's the grassy knoll gunman. You know, you can listen to his story and take it for what it's worth. David Morales, I believe he could have been a shooter. This guy was involved in a lot of very shady operations. And I also believe, you might think I'm crazy, but George Bush Sr. could have been in the Dell Tex building. Richard Nixon could have been in Dealey Plaza. But, you know, I think Nixon probably would have had someone else do it. Antonio here, he could have been a shooter. This is pretty much a month or so's work of research kind of stuck into this mind map. So this is kind of, as complicated as it is, this is the best way we can kind of look into the mind of a researcher. And with something this complicated, Guy Bannister, sorry, forgot to include him. Guy Bannister, in the ONI, he was also in the FBI. head of the Chicago FBI office, so that probably connects him to both Hoover and to Sam Giancana. Oversaw Oswald when he was in New Orleans. Sheep-dipped Oswald, which means, made him look like he was pro-communist. Oswald spent a lot of time in Guy Bannister's office in association with David Ferry. Lee Harvey Oswald, Guy Bannister, David Ferry were also involved in the anti-Castro operations, especially one involving using cancer as a weapon, which is a very interesting story. But Guy Bannister, he was one of the first people to disappear and die after everything happened, just because he had so many connections to so many of these players. That's pretty much what I have here for the mind map. Like I said, if you would like to help work on this, I will put some way to contact me to get this map. If you'd like to help me work on it, I would appreciate the help, especially if you know how to make this look cleaner. So either just this one guy over here in the middle here did it, and he just knew somehow all these people, and all these people were wrongly accused of being involved in the assassination or cover-up, or you're looking at how JFK was killed right in front of you. Like I said, I made this with Xmind. You can download it for free. And that concludes the lecture on the mind map. Thank you. It was 50 years ago that the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, took a trip to Dallas, Texas, and was gunned down in front of the public while his limousine was driving a motorcade route. Just a very brief time afterwards, a suspect was apprehended named Lee Harvey Oswald. This slight and soft-spoken man was viewed as a vile, murderous monster right from the start because those involved in the investigation pinned it on him right away. The assassination has turned into a curiosity and footnote in American history. But I think knowing the truth about what happened that day, and why, may be more important than any other event in our lifetimes. Many of us feel perturbed about the whole event, and a bit of agitation creeps into our stomach. I'm included in this group, so I decided to take a fresh look from an independent standpoint and find out if he did it or he was innocent. In the end, I figured out it wasn't just about who the trigger men were, but who contracted them, and that this single event has caused a skew in the timeline of America and the world and set into motion a series of dominoes that have begun falling and continue to affect us in a major way, even 50 years later. I uncovered some incredible information that sheds light on those events through the morass of lies, hype, wild theories, and misinformation. I felt it necessary to teach others about it so we can try to fix these things today and never let this happen again tomorrow. Before we dive into the JFK assassination, I want you to bear with me for a moment. Let's talk about human nature, specifically the nature of men. Men do many different things in life for many different reasons, but most men go through life trying to achieve as much as they can so that they can get the woman they want and make enough money that they can do whatever they want, as well as leave a legacy. Most want to leave their families cared for after they are gone and continue their genetic line. This is basically how men are wired biologically. Most want to live happily, enjoy life, as well as assure our legacy by the survival and thriving of our children. So what happens when a man achieves these things? What happens when a man has so much money that he could never spend it all in a lifetime? What happens when a man has been satisfied by the woman or women in his life, already had children, and knows that many generations to come will be assured financial stability? A man who has had all the experiences that he could think of in all the cars, boats, jet planes, and everything else he could ever have? Men who achieve all these things in life are usually the types that are very hard workers, obsessive, and to commit this murder had a great advantage. They knew there would be a ton of suspects. They also knew that critical thinking people would start pointing fingers all over the place at all sorts of different people and groups. The ones who are the type to go along to get along would accept the results in the short and fast investigation that resulted in the story of a lone, crazed gunman. They also knew that the people who questioned that result would have so many ideas of who could have done it that they would be confused with all the different possibilities. The confusion from this would actually benefit the killers because nobody would ever know who actually did it, instead of obsessing over this detail or that. They would get so involved and married to their own theory that they would reject others. In the end, the truth would be so obscured nobody would ever know what really happened, except for the men who actually aimed down that sight and pulled the trigger. And even if and when these men admit to doing this, they most likely will not be believed or discredited. Then again, evidence may show Oswald did do this, and he was killed before his confession, even though he enthusiastically denied the charges. It is easy to just accept it as what happened, because at the end of the day, it is the least frightening scenario or reason for his assassination. And at the same time, you can seem smart to go with the story and call anyone who disagrees paranoid. It keeps you feeling warm and cozy when your head hits the pillow. Let's get a better idea of what happened. Let's dive into the investigation by listing our main suspects. Because if Oswald didn't do it, the evil people who did must have had a reason for it, and most likely are still in positions of power today. Before I get into the meat of this, there are a few more things that need to be said. The people who I'm listing as suspects are not necessarily just one person, but rather a group of individuals in some cases. I believe that most of the people that are involved in these groups are not bad people. Because of compartmentalization, power, authority, money, national security, and other factors, there are certain people who belong to these groups that had a lot to do with or may be responsible for what happened. But that is not to say that everyone in these groups are evil, corrupt murderers. I will name names later, and these are in no particular order. So these are our suspects for the murder of JFK and what they would gain from it. The first suspect to approach is the Mafia, also known as the mob. These guys sure had a problem with JFK, but to get a good understanding of why, you need to know how JFK was elected, as well as a country called Cuba that the mob has had their hands in. So back when Kennedy was running for president, he needed a few key states to secure his place as the winner. His dad was good friends with the unions, which the mob has always had a hold on, and he had himself a sit down with some of these characters in the unions and the mob. He told these guys that it would be in their best interest to get his son JFK elected and convince them to get their people to vote for him. The mob was happy to have a chance for getting their man in office. JFK got the support from the unions in these key states and won the election by a hair. In a crazy twist of fate, just after his son was elected, Joe Kennedy, JFK's dad, had a stroke that caused him to be unable to speak as well as partially paralyzing him. Due to this, JFK had no reason to think that he owed the Mafia anything and viewed them, as most of us would have back then, as a major problem in the USA. He appointed his brother Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, and Robert went after the mob with a vengeance. He indicted and jailed more mobsters and organized crime figures than ever before and began to pick apart the mob piece by piece. This would be infuriating enough for the mob on its own. But wait, there's more. Cuba is thought of as some strange island we get cigars from illegally and was run by some crazy communist guy named Castro. Things weren't always like it. Turns most people off and lends less credibility to the message. They leave you scared of this or that, with the feeling of hopelessness and helplessness, that is not constructive. Many conspiracy theorists blame secret societies, rogue elements in the government, other nations, all the way to aliens and a reptilian race that secretly control the world, as well as hundreds more examples. Does spreading all these ideas out on the table really help accomplish anything? Let's look at history in an interesting and engaging way, so that it can be digested by everyone, not just certain sections of our culture. Conspiracy has become big business in itself, especially with the current state of our society. As a result, it becomes profitable to create these ideas, and many of them don't rely on very much or any hard evidence. Secrets, lies, and covert operations have been a part of every society since the beginning of civilization. Methods of secrecy and undercover operations have also been evolving with technology, industry, and social progression, just as everything else in civilization has. All organizations have an element of secrecy and don't ask, don't tell built into them as a general rule. For example, most people who work together may not divulge their hourly wage to their fellow employees. Most of the time they are not asked or lie about it. This doesn't mean that they are doing something evil or wrong, they just don't want to reveal certain things to others. This is one example of how secrecy is acceptable in our world. Secrets between a group of people can be difficult, but men realized that they could conduct operations involving multiple people without any one of those single individuals knowing they were participating in something bigger. This has been tested and achieved many times in different organizations. One of the best ways to distribute information as well as engage people in an operation that you don't want the full scope of to be revealed is to use a system called compartmentalization. Compartmentalization utilizes a need-to-know idea, meaning that everyone involved in the operation only gets the information they need to accomplish the task that they are asked. They are not informed of the full scope or directive of what they are involved in, but just enough to do their part. Using this system, you can get many people to be part of something either good, evil, or indifferent, with or without their knowledge. For example, the person who puts the dashboard together in a car is not fully responsible for the car, but plays his part and only needs to play his part for the final product or result to be achieved. He does not need to know how to put the locks on the car, and in fact doesn't need to know anything but the dashboard and its specifications to get his part finished. You could even keep the rest of the car a secret from him, but in the end, you would have the same result. If we take this approach with military or business operations, the same can be achieved, with only a few people or even just one person needing to be at the top putting it all together, and they are the only ones who know the end game objective. There is one way that you can justify or cover up, lie, or deny anything that you need to, especially as a person in power or in government. It just needs to be a, quote, matter of national security. People in all positions will do almost anything if told that their participation is to do with national security. Scientific experiments have shown that people are willing and able to do just about anything, including unspeakable acts to each other, when a person in authority tells them or orders them to do it. Most people have been brought up to follow authority and do what they have been told. When you put these things together, it becomes almost a double whammy, meaning that if someone who has authority over you tells you to do something, and that it is a matter of national security, you're twice as likely to do it. Many things can be justified using the reason of national security, and also because of the nature of it needing to be kept secret, it is usually never spoken of by the participators. Most people are not aware of one of the most powerful emotions there is in human beings, fear. Fear can be the ultimate motivator. Fear is a powerful force and is used all the time as a reason to do something or not to. Fear has been built into us biologically as a survival mechanism. Way back in our family tree, this emotion was essential to prevent death or harm, such as being afraid of starving to death or being afraid of a pack of wolves. Fear can be used to make people do things they normally wouldn't do. It can be used as a tool to trick, deceive, and manipulate one person or many. It can cause good people not to act against evil, and it can cause bad people to act even worse. Sometimes we even are influenced by fears that don't seem rational. When threatened, a person is capable of things they would never be normally. Those who have authority over others regularly use fear as a motivator to get what they need done. A person who is in fear of losing their job, or in worse cases, losing their family, is much more apt to do something they normally wouldn't to protect them. This all goes back to our basic wiring. We want to live happily, make enough money, and continue our genetic line. If someone is able to threaten that, then you will do anything you can to keep it. This includes doing things that may hurt others. Let's start putting it together. We are wired to desire wealth and power, and those who achieve the most of this are usually very smart and driven individuals, or at least have come from a family that is. These people can use their power to further their ideas and interests, using authority and control over the people underneath them. Using compartmentalization and other forms of programming and control, they increase their stand without revealing their motives to others. These men feel a need to keep this authority and increase it more and more. They use the power to further their ideas and exterminate the ideas or belief of others. You can't necessarily get mad at those who desire these things because for the most part, in some way, everybody does. But using power for your own self-interest at the detriment of the masses of other people causes a major conflict. You end up with extremely powerful folks doing whatever they see fit, manipulating people without them even knowing it, causing massive harm as well as death to others and getting away with it scot-free. This can be a double-edged sword, because if men had no reason to strive to reach lofty goals, to get in power, many things that we take for granted may never have been. To understand why men kill, we have to look at the reasons that these things happen. Men kill for money, power, women, revenge, or God. Almost every murder ever committed can be traced to these factors. One of the main things that homicide investigators look for is who benefits from the killing to begin building their list of suspects. They look at family and friends first, then begin looking at other associates of the victim. Most of the time, the perpetrator of the crime is one of these people. Since the Kennedy killing was at its root a homicide, I decided to take the same outlook on building my list of suspects. These are not conspiracy theories, even though they may be called that. Instead, they are just ideas based on facts or accounts of witnesses. It has been 50 years since this happened, and even though it's considered a closed case, it really needs to be reopened and re-examined because 75% or more of Americans don't think we got the right result. This is important because it was the highest profile homicide of the 20th century, and in the mind of the masses, someone got away with it. Kennedy will have a large list of people to look at based on his job and his life, and I was determined to look at as many possibilities as there were. People who were intelligent and driven, they have gotten so much through birth or very hard work, but they still want more. They still want to accomplish more and strive for that next level. When a man has all he could ever desire, and even men who aspire to this, will strive for the next level, and that is when he wants power. Power means control, measuring up to your peers, leaving a legacy, and the ability to push your ideas forward and defeat the ideas of others. Power cannot be measured, so there is no end to it, and some people who are set on getting as much as they can are almost like drug addicts looking for a fix. Power can be just as addicting as anything else, and over history, this has led to grim consequences. The men who built the system of government in the United States were aware of the shortcomings of men and men in power because they saw it happen all over the world. They had seen how things begin to fall apart and society suffer when the desires of a few win out over the desires of a whole people. They thought by creating this democracy, it may help to curb the problem of men in power taking advantage of that power by using a system of checks and balances, meaning there really was no one man or group in charge at any time, and the leaders would be chosen by the people. This was a great idea at its base, but there were many loopholes in this that they never suspected, and they have all been found and taken advantage of by those who came after them. In our current time, there has been the development of certain intelligence organizations, as well as powerful corporate interests influencing politics. This created a chance for power, secrecy, and warfare, both standard and psychological, to thrive. At the same time, they kept the image up to the people through mass media that is always a fair and honest government, with leaders who can always be blindly trusted. This is a fatal error of the people because history has shown the opposite. This may seem shocking to some people, but part of the way the American system works is so that the average citizen never really thinks about the big picture with all that's going on in their individual lives, and reject the idea of our government ever doing anything monumentally evil or malicious, even at a subconscious level. Conspiracy is a word that I have grown to dislike. Conspiracy theory is even worse. The second people even hear this word, they immediately jump to a conclusion before even hearing what it may be about. Some just love conspiracy theories and will believe every one they hear, and only research along the line of the theory they believe, picking apart minute details, never acknowledging that it may only be partially true, not true at all or otherwise. On the other hand, there are people who have grown tired of hearing them, or just dismiss them based on the fact that it's called a conspiracy theory in the first place. They tune out as soon as they get an inkling that it may be called a conspiracy theory. This is why I don't like the terms at all, because they create such a divide before the point is ever made. The problem is that there are theories that make sense, and there are ones that are just ludicrous. As far as the JFK assassination, there are so many it would blow your mind, and you could never hear them all. Everything from the driver to Jackie Kennedy herself pulling the trigger. Problem is, with such a large amount of theories and information, the truth is easily lost in the shuffle. This happens with most conspiracy theories, blurring the line of real and fake, causing most of them to be ignored, false, or rendered moot. This is an effect that actually helps the true perpetrators of the crime, because the more theories that are out there, the more ridiculous they are, the more the truth has been blurred. Another branch of conspiracy, especially on the internet, is what I call spooky theories. They are videos and articles that usually have doom and gloom music or just text scrolling around the screen and the flashing of a few pictures. Some would argue that it matches up with the subject matter, but in my opinion,